Chapter 364. At this moment, blood flowed like a river in the city. All the buildings in Hangzhou were made of stacked stones, forming alleys of varying depths. When the Mahist army suddenly appeared on the streets and messed up the troops, countless soldiers in black appeared on the roofs on both sides of the streets with bows and arrows. No one could not recognize them. They were the most elite Black Cloud cavalry of the Mahist army. It was said that every soldier of the Black Cloud cavalry was a 1 in 100 archer. The rain of arrows mercilessly poured down on the West Hill soldiers on the streets. This was not a battle, but a one-sided massacre. The Black Cloud cavalry took the high ground and attacked first. Their archery skills were obviously better than the West Hill soldiers. The West Hill soldiers had no chance to fight back and were forced into the narrow alleys. However, what awaited them was not a good fate. They were either shot in the chest by arrows from the roofs, or their throats were slit by people who appeared out of nowhere. The empty Hangzhou city instantly became a purgatory on earth. Outside the city, Genom of Gojoseon's face alternated between green and white. Now that things had come to this, he finally understood what he felt was wrong about these days. They thought that they had chased the Mahist army back to Hangzhou, but who could tell him where the cavalry that appeared behind them came from? Yi Li had actually hidden a cavalry of nearly 30,000 people behind them without anyone noticing. And these days, the people who were dizzy with victory did not even think about the strength of the Mahist army, which was once known as the leader of all countries. Among the countless black whirlwinds, the red figure at the front was particularly conspicuous. Feng Zhiyao sat on his horse like a red whirlwind sweeping past. Everywhere he went, the West Hill soldiers avoided him. His handsome face was full of wanton and carefree. After enduring for so many days, he could finally fight to his heart's content. In terms of military strategy, he was not as good as Genom of Gojoseon. In terms of military experience, he was not as good as Genom of Gojoseon. But so what? 30,000 cavalry against 30,000 infantry. In this flat land, there was no need for military strategy or strategy. It did not stop him from beating the West Hill people. Almost in a happy mood, Feng Zhiyao's spear slashed across the throats of several West Hill soldiers. He spurred his horse and swept past the king of Jinnan's army. From a distance, he smiled and said, "Your Highness the King of Jinnan, our Wang Fei wants this humble one to greet the King of Jinnan on your behalf." This greeting was definitely a form of mockery. Genom of Gojoseon of Gojoseon of Gojoseon, Genom of Gojoseon of Princess of Gojoseon's mind. It's just that. I would like to know, after Princess Ding burned Xinyang and destroyed Hangzhou's city gate tower, when Ai's reinforcements arrive, how will she defend Hangzhou? Feng Zhiyao laughed loudly and said, "Thank you for your concern, Prince. But our consort has also said that all the soldiers of West Hill who enter the northwest will be killed without exception." Genom of Gojoseon snorted, "What a boastful tone. I am already exhausted from dealing with a mere 200,000 strong army, yet you still dare to boast like this. I may lose soldiers and generals, but the Mahist army won't fare any better." Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows and laughed, "Prince, do you think the Mahist army is afraid of you West Hill people?" The princess consort was only worried about His Highness Genom of Gojoseon. The 300,000 reinforcements did not have Genom of Gojoseon with them. Whether or not they will come to Hangzhou is another matter. Genom of Gojoseon's expression changed slightly, but his face remained calm. However, his heart was already in a perilous situation. He had lost this round. Even though he had not seen the final outcome, Genom of Gojoseon understood that he had lost to Mo Lufang in the first half of his life, but he had not expected to lose to a woman in the second half of his life. Even though he had seen the outcome in front of him, he could not accept it wholeheartedly. After a few exchanges, he already knew in his heart that Yi Li was not some kind of world-shaking genius. It was because of this that he could not understand how the outcome in front of him had come about. After a long time, Genom of Gojoseon looked at the laughing red-clothed figure and said with a ferocious expression, "Order the gold-robed guards to capture Yi Li at all costs." "Prince, now here, kill." The reason Genom of Gojoseon fell for it was because he underestimated me too much. In a small valley about a dozen li away from Hangzhou City, Yili listened to the sounds of fighting that had not stopped in the direction of Hangzhou. She said to the confused Zhuo Jing and the others beside her, if his opponent was Xiu Yao, he definitely would not have fallen for such a trick. Zhuo Jing said, Princess if Prince did this, Genom of Gojoseon would only think that it was a trick and change Princess, but he would not. Yili smiled faintly and said, no matter how careful Genom of Gojoseon thinks he is, but, a man's natural contempt for a woman will not decrease. At most, he will be a little less than others. Wei Lin smiled and said, I believe that after this, Genom of Gojoseon will not underestimate Princess again. Princess, after the battle outside the city ends, will they enter the city to help the brothers inside? Lin Han asked. Yili was silent for a long time and finally said, no, they will immediately go to help Marquis Nan. Everyone was silent. There were 70,000 Shilling army in the city, but only 10,000 Mahist army remained. No one could say how many would come out in the end. The 30,000 Black Cloud cavalry hidden outside the city, after killing the 30,000 Shilling soldiers, had to go to the border to help Marquis Nan. Marquis Nan and Marquis Nan Shitzi, Yun Ting, and a few other junior generals had to take 30,000 men to stop the 300,000 reinforcements from Shilling. No one could say how many would come back. It was not that Princess was ruthless. Everyone knew that they did not have that many soldiers. Princess had already made the best arrangements. Princess, it is time to leave. If we hurry, we can reach a small city to rest tonight. Yili turned her head to look at the city in the distance and nodded silently. Princess, there is a large group of soldiers heading towards Hangzhou. The shadow guard who was scouting ahead hurriedly came back to report. Yili paused. She frowned slightly and asked, who are they? The shadow guard said, they are the garrison troops from the neighboring Hangzhou. Why are they coming now? She knew that the generals from the neighboring garrisons had sent letters to the emperor to help Hangzhou. But these generals were all loyal to Mo Jingqi. She had sent people to ask for reinforcements, but without Mo Jingqi's decree, these generals were not willing or did not dare to lend her troops. They only promised that they had sent a letter to the capital asking for reinforcements. Yili understood Mo Jingqi's mentality and did not have much hope in this promise. Could they be the reinforcements for Hangzhou? Lin Han asked. Zhuo Jing said coldly, the timing is too much of a coincidence. Princess, I will go and take a look. Yili frowned and said, go, but be careful. Zhuo Jing was personally trained by Yili and was efficient in his work. He came back in less than 2 hours, but his expression was very ugly. Looking at Yili, Zhuo Jing said, Princess, they are not here to help. Everyone was stunned. Mo Hua said coldly, could it be that they are here to help the West Hill people? Zhuo Jing shook his head and said, they have set up camp a few miles away. I went in and eavesdropped on their conversation. He plans to stand by and watch. If we win, they will take advantage of the fact that we do not have time to rest to attack us. If the West Hill wins, we will act according to the situation and retreat to the camp. If both sides suffer, it will be better. They will take advantage of us. Chapter 365. What is that person in the palace thinking? Does he not want Hangzhou anymore? Lin Han asked in shock. Yili laughed coldly. He had already given the 3 provinces in the northwest to Xiling. Whether he wins or loses this battle, the northwest is no longer his. Naturally, it doesn't matter. What a lunatic. After a long time, Wei Lin finally spat out this sentence. How important was the northwest to the Chu state? Even someone like him, who had no interest in military affairs, knew this. In order to deal with the Ding king, Mo Jingqi actually gave up the northwest, also. Zhuo Jing's face darkened. The nearby garrisons have all received the emperor's secret edict. Take this opportunity to eliminate all the Mahist army in the northwest. Most importantly, capture the princess consort, dead or alive. The atmosphere instantly became heavy. After a long time, Mo Hua snorted with a dark expression. He said to Zhuo Jing and the rest, "Protect the princess consort." After speaking, he turned to leave. Yi Li frowned, asking, "Where are you going?" Mo Hua gritted his teeth and laughed sinisterly. "I'll bring people to kill the generals leading the troops. Let's see how they can take advantage of the situation." Yi Li shook her head. "No, there are so many troops stationed near Hangzhou. If there is no one to control them, it will only become more chaotic. Also, the ones leading the troops may not be the ones who have the final say. Mo Jingqi will definitely send someone over." Mo Jingqi was not someone who could easily trust his officials. Since he could give such a secret edict, he would definitely send someone with a high status. Mo Hua turned to look at Yi Li, "Princess consort, what are your plans?" Yi Li paused for a moment before saying softly, "At least for today, we can't let them near Hangzhou city. Zhuo Jing, think of a way to let them know that I have already left Hangzhou." Everyone looked at Yi Li, their gazes filled with disapproval. Zhuo Jing said, "Princess consort, this is too dangerous." Yi Li sighed softly. "We can only do this now. We can only hope that the prince will be able to send someone to take over Hangzhou in time. Go ahead." Zhuo Jing stood where he was and refused to move even half a step. Yi Li's expression darkened. "This is an order." Zhuo Jing had no choice but to turn around and leave. Mo Hua was silent for a moment before saying, "The prince should be on his way to Hangzhou. Wang Fei, if we take a shortcut to the south, maybe we can meet the prince on the way." Yi Li turned her head to look at Hangzhou and said softly, "That's the only way. Let's go." Just as Mo Hua said, the group of people took a shortcut and headed south. Soon, the Dechu State's troops stationed not far away began to move. However, they didn't move in the direction of Hangzhou. Instead, they spread out as if they were looking for someone. At the same time, another group of elite troops quickly crossed the Hangzhou city and headed towards the Great Pass. Under the night sky, the sound of weapons colliding could be heard in the forest. In the forest, more than 10 shadow guards surrounded Yi Li to protect her in the center. They calmly faced the enemies who continuously surrounded them. The ground around them was littered with corpses. The thick smell of blood filled the forest. "Wang Fei, we've been surrounded." Mo Hua stood beside Yi Li and said in a low voice. Yi Li nodded. "It's obvious." Their group had less than 50 people, while the enemy had at least 700 to 800 people. Moreover, after seeing the signal sent by the enemy earlier, she didn't doubt that more enemies were coming. "Should I say that Mo Jingqi really values me enough?" Lin Han said, "I'm afraid that in their eyes, Hangzhou will be destroyed sooner or later. Naturally, capturing Wang Fei is more important." Most importantly, they had heard from one of the captured generals that Mo Jingqi's secret edict mentioned that the person who captured Princess Ding would be rewarded 10,000 taels of gold and be promoted 3 levels. Killing Princess Ding would also give them 10,000 taels of gold. In comparison, the benefits of participating in the war in Hangzhou were negligible. Mo Hua looked at the 4 of them and said, "You guys protect Wang Fei and rush out. We'll block these people." Yi Li smiled helplessly and said, "It'll be difficult for just a few people to rush out. Let's go together." Mo Hua paused. He understood that Wang Fei was telling the truth. Now that they were surrounded in the forest, if they wanted to rush out, they would be courting death. Moreover, Princess Ding was the target of these people's attention. Lowering her head, Yi Li dodged a soldier's spear. Then, she turned around and easily broke the other party's throat. The smell of blood in the air made her frown uncontrollably. She suppressed the urge to vomit in her heart. "Princess Ding, please come out to talk." Suddenly, the enemy general's loud voice came from outside the forest. The surrounding attacking soldiers had clearly received the order and stopped. They only stared at them cautiously. Yi stood behind the shadow guard. Her expression was calm as she calmly asked, "Which general are you?" The other party chuckled and said, "Wang Fei doesn't need to know. We have no intention of harming Wang Fei. We only ask that Wang Fei come out of the forest and immediately escort Wang Fei back to the capital to rest." Yi smiled coldly. His words were really pleasant to hear. After returning to the capital, what awaited her was endless house arrest and exploitation. They were just using her to negotiate with Mo Xiuyao. Moreover, she was pregnant now. She definitely could not fall into Mo Jingqi's hands. Based on Mo Jingqi's hatred towards the Prince Ding mansion and his jealousy towards Mo Xiuyao, it was hard to imagine what he would do. Seeing that Yi did not reply, the other party became impatient. In a low voice, he said, "Wang Fei, we also know that Prince Ding is currently leading troops here. Thus, we don't have much time to give Wang Fei. If Wang Fei does not come out in 2 hours, please forgive us for our rudeness." Wei Lin smiled coldly and said, "Since you know that Prince Ding is about to arrive, you still dare to be so rude to Wang Fei. Do you not want your little lives anymore?" The other party was silent for a moment before saying, "We have no choice but to share the wealth of the monarch. We hope that Princess Ding will be magnanimous enough to forgive us." After that, the atmosphere was tense as they waited. Yi looked at the countless pairs of eyes staring at them from not far away. She gently stroked her flat stomach and smiled helplessly and tiredly. "Shuojing, right now. I wonder what the situation in Hangzhou is like." Shuojing said, "There weren't many soldiers who came first. I'm afraid that all of them were used to capture us. As long as nothing unexpected happens, the situation in Hangzhou shouldn't be too different from what Wang Fei had predicted." Yi nodded with a gratified smile. "That's good. Finally, one side has won." Lin Han asked in a low voice, "Wang Fei, what should we do now?" Yi calmly raised her eyes and said in a low voice, "Head to the southeast corner and rush out." Mo Hua's brows furrowed in worry. Wang Fei's body, Yi smiled coldly. "If she falls into their hands, what do you think will happen?" Mo Hua did not speak. Perhaps if a Princess Ding fell into Mo Jingqi's hands, she would not die or be used to threaten the prince. But if a Prince Ding mansion with a future heir fell into Mo Jingqi's hands, it would definitely be a disaster. Not only would it be a disaster for the prince's wife, it would be a disaster for the entire Mahist army. Mo Hua looked deeply at Yi and bowed to Yi with unprecedented respect. "I will listen to Wang Fei's orders." The southeast corner led deep into the mountains. The terrain was more rugged and dangerous than other places. Perhaps because of this, there were fewer people guarding this side than the other sides. This was their only hope to rush out. With Yi order, all the shadow guards rushed in that direction. Along the way, they showed no mercy. It could be said that if God blocked them, they would kill God. If Buddha blocked them, they would kill Buddha. Behind them, there were also angry shouts from outside the forest. "Kill them. No matter if they're dead or alive, don't let a single one escape." Chapter 366. Relying on this invincible momentum, the group actually managed to break out of the encirclement and headed deeper into the mountains. However, there were only 7 or 8 shadow guards left. Including Mo Hua, Shuojing, and the others, they were all riddled with injuries. Only Yi, who was protected in the middle, did not suffer any external injuries other than looking a little tired. There were few traces of people in the deep mountains and forests. Even if the enemy had thousands of people, it was not easy to find a few people hiding in such a vast forest. The next morning, the group had already gotten rid of their pursuers. However, at the same time, they were deep in the mountains and did not know where to go. They could only move in a general direction. Including her previous life, Yi had never been in such a difficult situation. Although she had experienced much worse conditions in her previous life, that was on the premise that her body was still very healthy. But now, because of her pregnancy, even if it did not affect her movements, her mental and physical strength were clearly not able to take it. The first 3 months of pregnancy was a dangerous period. It was not suitable for vigorous activities. Although it was only a day, Yili was still faintly uncomfortable. She was very clear in her heart that if she was not careful, she could very likely lose her first baby. They found a relatively flat and hidden place to rest. The group ate some dry food and water. Lin Han said, "As long as we don't meet any pursuers, we will be fine if we leave this place." Wei Lin shook his head and said, "Although we don't know the exact location, but from the position of this mountain, no matter which direction we go, we will be very far away from Prince and the Mahist army. And if we go back the way we came, we will very likely meet some pursuers." Yili thought for a while and said, "Lin Han, you go back alone and find Prince." Lin Han disagreed and said, "If we go back to ask for help, we only need to send a shadow guard. This subordinate will be able to help if I stay here." Yili shook his head and said, "No, the way back will be very dangerous. I will only be at ease if you, Zhuo Jing or Wei Lin go back. And now that we are deep in the mountains, as long as we are careful and hide, the chances of encountering a large group of pursuers is very small. Go quickly and come back quickly. If anything happens to the people on the way back, no one will know that we are here. When the time comes." Wei Lin patted Lin Han's shoulder and nodded. Lin Han glanced at everyone and could only nod. "Yes, this subordinate will definitely find Prince as soon as possible." Yili nodded. "Be careful on the road." After sending Lin Han off, everyone rested in this relatively flat area for a while. Yili was sitting under a big tree. She leaned against the trunk and looked up at the sky through the layers of shade. The corners of his lips lifted into a wry smile of self-mockery. How embarrassing, in this world. She knew that she was not strong enough. This was the era of cold weapons. Compared to those top experts, her inner strength was not strong enough, and her qinggong was not good enough. On the battlefield, compared to those truly exceptional generals, the military theories she had learned were of no use. She only relied on a completely different way of thinking from ordinary people. This time, in the confrontation with Genom of Gojoseon, she seemed to have the upper hand, but she knew in her heart that in a situation where the military forces and reserves were completely equal, it was very likely that she would be defeated in at most 3 months. She also understood that, in fact, she could have chosen to live in a more relaxed and comfortable way. As a woman, no one could say that she was wrong. But, in the end, she still could not completely see herself as a weak woman in this era. She watched men fight for their lives outside, while she enjoyed the extravagant food and clothing provided by them with a clear conscience. Even when she was in such a difficult situation, she did not regret it. At least, she had done what she could and did not stay in the capital and wait to be captured by Mo Jingqi and used as a chess piece to threaten the father of her child. Supporting herself against the tree, Yili stood up and walked to the fire on the side. The night of early winter was already very cold. The 3 shadow guards who were busy roasting meat and cooking soup saw Yili come over and quickly stood up. Yili waved her hand and said, "Everyone is tired. Don't be so polite. Sit down." The shadow guards had clearly never met such a master before. They looked hesitantly at Zhuo Jing, who was sitting on a tree with his eyes closed. Mo Hua had taken people to go hunting. They could only seek the opinion of Zhuo Jing, who was also a shadow guard. Sensing the shadow guard's gazes, Zhuo Jing opened his eyes and glanced at them. He said, "We will listen to the princess's orders." Only then did the 3 of them sit down again. They continued with their work in silence. Compared to before, their expressions were much more reserved. Yili smiled faintly and reached for a branch to poke at the fire. She picked up a skewer of bird meat that had been roasted on the fire and threw it onto a tree branch. Wei Lin, who was hanging upside down on the tree, reached out and caught it. Without saying anything, he took a bite and ate it. Zhuo Jing, who was on the tree on the other side, was drooling. Princess consort. Yili raised her eyebrows and threw another skewer over. Zhuo Jing cheered and ate happily. Yili turned back to look at the shadow guards who had a shocked expression at their interaction. She smiled and said, "Everyone is hungry. Eat first. When Mo Hua and the others return, we will roast theirs." Zhuo Jing bit into the roasted meat as he mumbled, "I said, when I go out to hunt, I will definitely be faster than Commander, cough cough. Mo Hua." It seemed that because of the interaction between Yili, Zhuo Jing and Wei Lin, the atmosphere gradually eased. Yili endured the smoke and grease from the fire and ate the roasted meat in her hand without any appetite. A shadow guard looked at her and took out 2 fist-sized red wild fruits to give to Yili. He said shyly, "I picked this on the way. If Princess does not mind, please eat this." Yili smiled and took it. She wiped it and took a bite. The slightly sour and sweet fruit made her feel much better. She nodded and smiled at the shadow guard. "Thank you." The shadow guard's face turned red and he hurriedly said he did not dare. As she ate the wild fruit, she looked at the shadow guards who were curiously examining her. Yili smiled faintly and asked softly, "I've implicated you this time. Are you afraid?" These shadow guards were all young and outstanding youths. If they were reorganized in the future, no matter if they were placed in the Black Cloud Cavalry Mahist Army or the Qi Lin, their future would be limitless. But this time, almost all of them had been sacrificed with her. Not afraid. The shadow guard who gave Yili the wild fruit said loudly, "It is the glory of the shadow guard to be able to die for the prince and princess consort." "Nonsense," Yili said softly. "You do not want to live first. Why do you want to die for loyalty? If you all die, who will not be loyal to the Wang Fu?" The 3 youths looked in puzzlement at Yili. What Princess Consort said was clearly different from what they had been taught since they were young. They could not understand. Does Princess Consort mean that we should be afraid of death and flee at the last moment? Even though we are not the Black Cloud Cavalry or the Mahist Army that is famous in the countries, we will not do such a thing. The 3 youths clearly did not agree with Yili's words. Yili said with a smile, "Death, there are those that are heavier than Mount Tai and those that are lighter than a goose feather. If you give up your life for a small matter or slit your throat because of a small setback, then even if you are loyal, it is foolish loyalty. If you have done everything you can for the greater good, for your ideals, for your beliefs, but can only sacrifice yourself in the end, then even if you die and lose, you are still a true warrior." The 3 youths were thoughtful. In reality, the shadow guard and people like them had an unwritten rule. For example, if they failed an important mission, many people would apologize with their lives. As shadow guard, they had seen many examples like this. They even had the same thoughts. Therefore, even though they were sad that they had to protect Princess Consort's brothers who had died, they were mentally prepared. If something happened to Princess Consort, they would all apologize with their lives. But hearing Princess Consort's words, it seemed that Princess Consort felt that their actions were not correct. Chapter 367. Wang Fei, if you made a mistake, shouldn't you use death to atone for it? Yili rolled her eyes at the sky and asked, "If the person who made the mistake uses death to atone for it, does that mean that the mistake no longer exists? Then, what should be done?" "Of course you should try to survive and atone for your mistake. Death is the action of a coward," Yili said firmly. The 3 youths thought for a long time before one of them carefully asked, "Wang Fei, will Qi Lin still want people?" Yili smiled, "You also know about Qi Lin?" The 3 nodded in unison. Qi Lin was not completely hidden in the Mahist army and King Ding's Fu. Compared to the hundreds of thousands of Mahist armies scattered all over the place, the Shadow Guard obviously knew more. The three youths looked at Zhuo Jing and Wei Lin, who were hanging upside down on a tree not far away, and their eyes were filled with envy and yearning. They were all from Fuji, and some of them had even trained and grown up with them. But now, they looked so different. Yili tilted her head and smiled. Of course, if you can return alive this time, I may be able to talk to Qin Feng and ask him to give you a chance. But, do you want to convince Mo Hua yourself? The three youths were overjoyed and their youthful faces flashed with vitality, sweeping away their previous fatigue and depression. Someone is coming. Zhuo Jing and Wei Lin jumped down from the tree at the same time and landed beside Yili with vigilant expressions. The other people also quickly stood up and prepared for battle. Yili listened and said in a deep voice, "Two groups of people, one group is going up the mountain and is still far from here. The other group is going up and coming down is Mo Hua's group." The shadow guard behind her had quickly extinguished the fire, and in a blink of an eye, Mo Hua had also brought a few shadow guards to the front. Mo Hua said with a heavy face, "Just now, I saw someone coming up the mountain." Yili frowned and said, "Going down the mountain is definitely not possible. The foot of the mountain is completely surrounded. Is there a path up the mountain?" Mo Hua said, "There is a cliff at the top of the mountain, and the mountain opposite the cliff is completely separated from here. If we can make it. Is it okay?" Yili asked. Mo Hua nodded slightly. "It's worth a try." Yili exhaled slightly and said in a deep voice, "Let's go up the mountain." The group walked up the mountain. Along the way, Yili noticed that a few shadow guards had left their group under Mo Hua's signal. Yili knew that they were trying to distract the pursuers that could catch up with them at any time. Glancing at the shadow guard who left silently, Yili didn't say anything. She just silently followed the shadow guard's footsteps up the mountain. The pursuers seemed to be coming very quickly. Not long after, the sound of a crowd and the sound of close combat could be heard from afar. However, the sound gradually faded away. It was obvious that someone had led them in the opposite direction. Mo Hua turned her head to look at the place where the sound was getting farther and farther away. She frowned and said, "Wang Fei, the people coming up the mountain don't seem to be the pursuers of the imperial court." Yili nodded silently. That group of people had just been at the foot of the mountain. If they could catch up so quickly, they definitely weren't ordinary soldiers. It was obvious that the other party was an expert. "They are Lei Jinting's people." Zhuo Jing said, "Zhennan Palace has a secret group of private guards called the Gold-Clothed Guards. There are about 1,000 of them. They usually guard Zhennan Palace. Every time Genin of Gojoseon goes on a campaign, they always accompany him. It was because of their existence that Genin of Gojoseon was able to escape death many times on the battlefield. This included when Genin of Gojoseon was defeated by the old prince. It was this group of gold-clothed guards that sacrificed almost all of their people to rescue him. The gold-clothed guards saved Genin of Gojoseon's life. Even though they were almost completely wiped out, Genin of Gojoseon rebuilt them afterwards. Yili asked as they walked up the mountain, "The shadow guard doesn't seem to have received this news." Zhuo Jing said, "Ever since the gold-clothed guards were almost completely wiped out by the old prince when they tried to save Genin of Gojoseon, they haven't appeared in front of anyone. Almost everyone thinks that they don't exist anymore." This subordinate was told by Master Mingyu before he left. Yili was deep in thought as they walked through the forest. What about the gold-clothed guards and Qilin? Without much thought, Zhuo Jing replied, "They can't compare. The gold-clothed guards only train in martial arts. They are only responsible for Genin of Gojoseon's safety and occasionally listen to Genin of Gojoseon's orders to deal with some people. Master Mingyu meant that their martial arts are not inferior to the shadow guards." Everyone's hearts were heavy. Even if 100 or 200 elite soldiers came at them, they might not be able to handle it, let alone the fact that they were not inferior to the shadow guards. As they walked, the group finally arrived at the edge of the cliff halfway up the mountain. Even though they were only halfway up the mountains in the northwest were not low. Moreover, it was the beginning of winter. Under the night sky, looking down the cliff, there was only a vast expanse of white clouds. Nothing could be seen below. Looking at the cliff in front of them, Yili turned her head and asked, "How far is it to the other side?" Mo Hua thought for a moment, then said, "About 15 or 16 zhang." Yili thought for a moment, then nodded and asked, "How is everyone's qinggong? Can you cross?" Mo Hua nodded. Of the people present, there were only 2 shadow guards whose qinggong was slightly weaker. The rest of them could cross. Yili said to the 2 shadow guards, "You two can go down the mountain together or separately. Be careful not to attract the attention of the pursuers. If the encirclement at the foot of the mountain is too tight, wait for a while." The 2 shadow guards were startled and looked at Yili helplessly. Yili sighed softly and said, "Hurry up and go. It's only 2 people. We'll be there soon. There's no point in you staying." Behind her, Mo Hua nodded silently. The 2 shadow guards bowed to Yili, then turned and left, quickly disappearing into the darkness. "All right, let's get ready to go. Mo Hua has studied the terrain before. You go first." Yili turned and said to Mo Hua. Mo Hua didn't delay. She tapped her feet and flew towards the cliff on the other side. When she landed, she could only see Mo Hua's blurry figure in the fog. Yili waved her hand to let the shadow guards go one by one. When it was Zhuo Jing and Wei Lin's turn, neither of them moved first. Yili raised an eyebrow and said, "What do you want to do?" Zhuo Jing said in a deep voice, "This subordinate and Wei Lin have seen Wang Fei's qinggong. You can't cross." Yili stilled and then smiled helplessly. If she had known that this day would come, she would have trained her qinggong even if she died of exhaustion. Her qinggong could only be considered second-rate. Right now, there was a faint feeling of discomfort coming from her abdomen. It was a dream to fly over by herself. Yili glanced at Zhuo Jing and said, "Can you take me over?" Zhuo Jing lowered his head and gritted his teeth, saying, "No." It required first-rate qinggong to cross a 15 to 16 zhang cliff. To take a person over, it didn't just require qinggong, it also required the support of great internal energy. Wei Lin smiled faintly and said, "This subordinate can't either, so we will stay and accompany Wang Fei." There was a faint noise coming from the distance. Yili swept an exasperated look over the 2 and said, "Nonsense. Are you going to die with me?" On the other side, a black shadow came through the air and landed on the ground. He looked at the 3 with a frown and said, "Why haven't you left?" His gaze paused on Yili's body. Mo Hua instantly remembered that Wang Fei had only practiced internal qinggong for a little over a year. This kind of distance could not be crossed with qinggong. This subordinate did not consider thoroughly. "Wang Fei, please forgive this subordinate. This subordinate will take Wang Fei over." Yili looked at him with a smile and asked, "How confident are you?" Mo Hua was silent. After a long time, he said in a deep voice, 20%. If it was daytime, maybe he would be 20% confident. But now, the sky was dark and there was a thick fog. At most, he only had 20% confidence. Yili shook her head and said with a smile, "Then you mean that we have an 80% chance of falling off the cliff and not leaving behind a corpse? You go over first. I have my ways." How could Zhuo Jing and the others be willing? Wei Lin said, "Then Wang Fei, please go over first. We don't need much time." Mo Hua frowned and said, "The pursuers are close. If they really are martial arts experts, if they find us, we won't be able to escape even if we go over." Chapter 368. The 3 were all stubborn. Yili could only say, "Mo Hua and Wei Lin will go first. Zhuo Jing will stay." She took out the rope from the bag beside her and handed it to Wei Lin. Wei Lin silently took it and leaped into the thick fog on the other side. Zhuo Jing watched as Yili fastened the rope to the tree by the cliff and asked, "Wang Fei, Yili smiled helplessly and said, "Actually, I only have 50% confidence." The cliffs on both sides were clearly not giving them face. The cliffs on their side were slightly lower and the cliffs on the other side were slightly higher. This meant that Yili could not use the most energy-saving method to slide over. She had to pull on the rope and slowly move over. Because of the baby in her belly, she couldn't use any movements that were too dangerous. After fastening the rope, Yili was just about to move when an arrow shot out of the forest and passed by her. Very quickly, a group of men in black charged out of the forest and surrounded the two of them on the cliff. "Princess Ding. We don't want to harm Wang Fei. Please come with us." The leader of the men in black stared at Yili, his eyes filled with malice and greed. Yili let go of the rope and calmly said, "Shiling Genom of Gojoseon, the golden-robed guards." The man's eyes narrowed and he sneered, "Wang Fei really knows a lot. Since Wang Fei already knows our identity, please don't make unnecessary resistance. If Wang Fei is harmed, we won't be able to answer to the prince." Yili raised an eyebrow and asked softly, "What if I don't listen?" The man sneered and said, "The prince is in a bad mood because of what happened in Hangzhou. If something happens to Wang Fei, I think the prince won't blame us. Our prince is a hero of the age and he truly admires Princess Ding. Wang Fei, why do you want to follow that trash Mo Xiuyao? Our prince has said that if Wang Fei is willing to come back with us, he will give you the position of consort to Genom of Gojoseon. As for that cripple Mo Xiuyao." Whoosh! Whoosh! Two air-piercing sounds were heard. Two gusts of strong wind carrying a silver light shot towards the man, one high and one low, leaving a bloody wound on the man's face and neck. Yili coldly looked at the person in front of her and said in a cold voice, "If you want to die, then this consort will help you." That person touched the wound on his neck and couldn't help sucking in a cold breath. Hearing Yili's cold words, he felt a chill in his heart and didn't dare to reply. "Since the princess is so ignorant, don't blame us for being rude." The leader's face darkened and he waved his hand, "Capture Princess Ding." The surrounding gold-clad guards swarmed forward. Zhuo Jing stood in front of Yili to block them. On the other side, Mo Hua, Wei Lin, and the others also understood the situation and returned to join the battle. The gold-clad guards were the elites that Han Mingyue had said could rival the Shadow Guard in battle. In a situation where one of them could fight against 10, the Shadow Guard had no way of fighting back. Yili looked at the Shadow Guard that had already been in the wrong. In an instant, 2 more had fallen. Yili took a deep breath and shouted, "Mo Hua, take the people and retreat." Mo Hua's hand did not stop. Her sword pierced through the chest of a gold-clad guard as she said, "The Shadow Guard prioritizes the safety of the princess and cannot follow orders." Yili slit the throat of a gold-clad guard with one hand and retreated to a corner. Her other hand pressed against her throbbing abdomen as she said, "Do you think there is any meaning now? Retreat." Mo Hua did not respond. Her actions became even more vicious, indicating that she was going to disobey orders. Yili felt her heart ache. Just as she was about to speak, a shadow flashed across the night sky and leapt in front of her. Yili raised her sword and swung it. The person moved to the side and grabbed Yili's arm, saying, "It's me." Yili stilled, "Han Mingyue, why are you here?" Han Mingyue's appearance was slightly disheveled and did not have her previous elegant demeanor. She grabbed Yili and said, "Quick, leave. Genom of Gojoseon has come." Seeing Han Mingyue, Zhuo Jing and Wei Lin were overjoyed. They tacitly separated the gold-clad guards in front of them and said, "Young Master Han, take Princess and leave first." Han Mingyue nodded. She grabbed Yili's arrowhead and was about to fly to the other side. "Han Mingyue, you are very daring." A deep male voice filled with anger came from the forest. At the same time, a strong gust of wind attacked Han Mingyue. Han Mingyue was in midair and dodged the gust of wind with another person in tow. Her internal energy was stopped for a moment. Her originally flying figure could only land back on the ground. The white clothing on her shoulder had a tear and was dyed a faint red. Genom of Gojosian walked out of the forest. Beside him was Su Zuidi, who had left Hangzhou with Han Mingyue. At this time, her beautiful face was filled with pride and schadenfreude. She smiled as she stared at Yi Li. When Genom of Gojosian arrived, the killing immediately stopped. Mo Hua and the others retreated in front of Yi Li and formed a semicircle to protect her behind them. Genom of Gojosian looked at the pale-faced Yi Li standing behind the crowd. His eyes flashed with a complicated light. He then looked at the corpse on the ground and nodded in praise, as expected of the Prince Ding Mansion's shadow guard. Ai's gold-clad guards are still lacking. Zhuo Jing laughed coldly, Prince is too humble. The Prince Ding Mansion's shadow guard has many duties. How can they compare to the gold-clad guards? As soon as he spoke, he mocked Genom of Gojosian for being a coward. Otherwise, why would he train thousands of people just to protect him? Genom of Gojosian was not angry. He looked at Yi Li and smiled, you are very good. You are completely out of Ai's expectations. As long as you come over, I can let bygones be bygones. Prince. Su Zuidi protested coquettishly, but she was frightened by Genom of Gojosian's cold gaze and swallowed her dissatisfaction. Yi Li looked at Genom of Gojosian, who was determined to win. She smiled and said, Prince is so fast. Yi Li admires you. Prince must have taken care of everything in and out of Hangzhou City. But Prince doesn't care about the hundreds of thousands of reinforcements at the northwest border. Genom of Gojosian's face darkened, but he quickly smiled and said, I am indeed worried about the reinforcements. But it is the first time in my life that I am under a woman's control. So I think that you are more important. Moreover, I don't know why, but I suddenly feel that losing the princess is more painful for Prince Ding than losing the northwest. And if this Princess Ding becomes Ai's princess consort of Genom of Gojosian. It seemed that the more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was a wonderful idea. Genom of Gojosian could not help but look up to the sky and laugh. The gloominess that was still on his face because of the loss at Hangzhou City also disappeared without a trace. Su Zuidi, who was standing beside him, heard his words and her expression changed. She glared fiercely at Yi Li, but because of Genom of Gojosian's prestige, she did not dare to say a word. Yi Li sneered and said, I'm afraid that Prince is thinking too much. Genom of Gojosian said leisurely, whether or not Ai is thinking too much, we will know soon. Shaoli, be a good girl and wait to become Ai's princess consort. Ugh. Finally unable to bear the discomfort in her chest, Yi Li turned to the side and retched against a big tree. The cliff was suddenly silent. Genom of Gojosian's face was ashen as he stared at the girl who was vomiting while leaning against a big tree. Han Mingyue casually treated the wound on her arm and said with a smile, Prince, it seems that Princess Ding is not interested in becoming Genom of Gojosian's princess consort. Your Highness, why must you force me to do something against my will? Wei Lin sneered, some people are just a toad lusting after a swan's meat. Wishful thinking. None of the golden-robed guards dared to speak up. Princess Ding vomited when she insisted on becoming Genom of Gojosian's princess consort. It was clear that she really hated this suggestion to a certain extent. They also did not dare to speak. If they flattered her, it would not be good. Chapter 369. Genom of Gojosian's face was ashen. He snorted coldly and said, do you think you can stall for time like this? Don't worry, I will let you go back with your lives. Tell Mo Xiuyao to come and attend Ai's concubine selection ceremony. Capture Princess Ding. The battle on the cliff began once again. Genom of Gojosian did not plan on watching from the side. Instead, he pounced towards Yi Li without hesitation. Zhuo Jing and Wei Lin tried to block him, but they were swept to the side in 2 or 3 moves. Han Mingyue and Mo Hua attacked Genom of Gojoseon from the left and right. Although Genom of Gojoseon only had one arm, his palm energy was like a knife. He had to use almost all of his strength to stop himself from being pushed back. Genom of Gojoseon snorted and laughed, "The so-called young heroes, you don't even have the strength of a teenager like Mo Xiaoyao. You want to stop? Go." He sent a palm towards Han Mingyue's chest. Han Mingyue was shocked and quickly flipped to the side to avoid the palm. She landed on the ground but was immediately surrounded by a few gold-robed guards. After dealing with Han Mingyue, Genom of Gojoseon used the same method to avoid Mo Hua. From the time he attacked to when he arrived in front of Yi Li, it only took him 7 or 8 moves. In the face of absolute strength, any fancy moves were meaningless. Yi Li flipped the dagger in her hand and quickly stabbed towards Genom of Gojoseon. The violent vomiting and the tiredness of the past few days not only made her face pale, but more importantly, she could clearly feel her strength draining away at a rapid rate. Genom of Gojoseon moved to the side to avoid the attack. He was in a good mood as he exchanged a few moves with her. He grabbed her wrist and laughed, "Your martial arts are not bad. It's a pity that your internal energy is a bit lacking. If you practiced martial arts from a young age, you could be ranked among the top experts in the world with your aptitude. But now... Wait, you..." The person holding Yi Li's wrist paused for a moment. Genom of Gojoseon's expression changed and he said sternly, "What a princess Ding. You are truly devoted to Mo Xiaoyao. I will definitely make this vile spawn. Die, bitch." Su Zuidi, who was not far away, looked at the scene in front of her with a twisted expression. She raised her hand to reveal the hidden weapon tied to her wrist and shot it at Yi Li. A cluster of silver needles rained down on Yi Li, and Han Mingyue, who was fighting with the gold-robed guards, paled. "Drunken butterfly, don't." But it was too late. With a flash of silver, the hidden weapon left the box. Han Mingyue did not have time to think. She swept aside the gold-robed guards with her sword and leapt forward. At the same time, Genom of Gojoseon also heard Su Zuidi's voice. He turned his head to look. Yi Li took the opportunity to turn her wrist and the dagger left a bloody mark on Genom of Gojoseon's hand. They had suffered heavy losses in Hangzhou. It would not be a good thing to face Mo Xiaoyao at this time. With a wave of his hand, Genom of Gojoseon walked past Zhuo Jing and the others into the forest. Su Zuidi quickly grabbed his arm and looked at him pitifully. "Prince," slap. A slap landed hard on Su Zuidi's beautiful face. Su Zuidi fell to the ground and rolled to the side due to the huge inertia. Genom of Gojoseon's cold and emotionless voice could be heard. "Imperial consort Qingrong Bai Long has suddenly fallen ill." After saying that, he walked into the forest without looking back. The gold-robed guards following behind Genom of Gojoseon did not dare to look at the beautiful woman who had fallen to the ground. Prince's meaning was very clear. He did not want to see this woman again. No matter how lustful they were, they did not dare to bring this woman along with them. No. Su Zuidi shook her head frantically. She had never thought that this would be the result. And this kind of acceptance also foreshadowed the tragic fate that would befall her in the future. "No. Don't, Your Highness." Unfortunately, the gold-robed guards left just as quickly as they came. In just a short while, they had completely disappeared into the forest. Zhuo Jing stood up and glanced coldly at the woman on the ground. He said in a cold voice, "Tie this bitch up and wait for Prince to deal with her." After saying that, he took back the rope that Yi Li had prepared to use to cross the cliff and threw it down the cliff. Wei Lin at the side also took out the rope that he carried with him and made the same preparations. Mo Hua looked at them silently and only spat out 2 words. "Be careful." Zhuo Jing nodded and jumped down the cliff with Wei Lin while holding on to the rope. The bottom of the cliff was still silent, but the atmosphere on the cliff was so heavy that it made it hard for people to breathe. Han Mingyue did not care about his sorry state. He leaned tiredly against a tree and closed his eyes to rest. His white shoulder was covered in scarlet spots and his entire shoulder seemed to be numb. Although he had just taken the antidote found on Su Zuidi's body, he still did not have the strength to move his body. Su Zuidi was thrown to the side after her pressure points were sealed without any mercy. At this time, she was crying miserably as she looked at Han Mingyue. Unfortunately, even if Han Mingyue had a trace of pity in his heart, he was powerless at this time. Mo Hua stood silently at the edge of the cliff. If not for his black hair fluttering in the wind, one would almost think that he was a statue and not a person. Chapter 370. An hour later, the foot of the mountain was once again in an uproar. Vaguely, countless torches could be seen surrounding this side. The imperial court's soldiers are about to arrive. Supporting her heavily injured body, Han Mingyue stood up and leaned against the tree to look at Mo Hua. Mo Hua's expression turned cold, a mocking smile on his lips. So what if they come up? Wang Fei was not here. Their lives and deaths did not matter to the situation. But soon, another row of torches appeared at the foot of the mountain. Then, they split into several fire dragons and moved up the mountain at an extremely fast speed. This was a movement that Mo Hua was familiar with. Mo Hua's lips moved and a bitter smile flashed across her lips. What was the use of coming now? Prince, you came too late. Soon, there was the sound of weapons clashing at the foot of the mountain. Not long after, a dark shadow rushed out of the woods in the night and went straight to the edge of the cliff. He grabbed Han Mingyue, who was standing closest to him against a tree, and asked sternly, "Where is Junwei?" "Where did Junwei go?" Han Mingyue's lips moved but she could not speak. His gaze slowly moved to the edge of the forest. Mo Xiaoyao quickly flew out of the forest. Before he landed, his gaze swept across the entire cliff and finally landed on Mo Hua. He asked in a deep voice, "Where is Wang Fei?" Mo Hua silently knelt on the ground. A long time later, he said hoarsely, "This subordinate is useless." Wang Fei fell off the cliff. Mo Xiaoyao's upright body swayed and a thread of blood appeared at the corner of his lips. His already pale and tired face became pale and green. He lowered his head and carelessly wiped the blood at the corner of his lips. But quickly, more blood came out of his mouth. Mo Hua's expression changed dramatically. He did not care that he was kneeling and begging for forgiveness. He stood and went forward to support the other. Mo Xiaoyao waved his hand and swept Mo Hua to the side. "Where did Zhuo Jing and Wei Lin go?" Mo Hua lowered his head and said, "They went down the cliff." Mo Xiaoyao waved his hand, and the Mahist army that followed him out of the forest did not need him to say anything. They all took whatever rope they could find and went down the cliff. Mo Xiaoyao looked at the injured people at the edge of the cliff, and his gaze paused on Han Mingyue for a moment. He walked to the edge of the cliff, and before anyone could react, he jumped down from the edge of the cliff, as if he had fallen into a boundless sea of clouds. When Feng Zhiyao appeared at the top of the cliff in a flustered and exasperated manner, his heart sank when he saw the scene in front of him. In the end, he was still too late. He stared blankly at the slightly brighter horizon. The white horizon seemed to be dyed with a faint red color, giving rise to an ominous feeling from the bottom of his heart. In the boundless night sky, because dawn was about to arrive, the stars in the sky had gradually dimmed. Then, a few stars flashed with a strange dark red light. Feng Zhiyao stood at the edge of the cliff with his hands behind his back. The 7 banes of the army destroyer were in the sky. The world was in chaos. It was not until noon of the second day that people gradually came up from the bottom of the cliff. But looking at the expressions of the people, Feng Zhiyao's originally not much hope seemed to be on the verge of collapse. When a dark red figure rushed up from the bottom of the cliff, everyone jumped in fright. Han Mingxi glared at the bottom of the cliff with a face full of hatred. Soon, another person jumped up from below. When he landed, he almost tripped, and his body swayed a bit before he steadied himself. He coldly stared at Han Mingxi standing at the side, and coldly said, Han Mingxi, you think I don't dare to kill you? Han Mingyue's heart went cold, and she somewhat imperceptibly blocked in front of Han Mingxi. He understood the man in front of him far better than Han Mingxi. He didn't know what Mo Xiaoyao had seen at the bottom of the cliff, but in just half a day, Mo Xiaoyao's aura had undergone a tremendous change. If the previous Mo Xiaoyao was a treasured sword hidden in a sheath, then the current Mo Xiaoyao was a bloodthirsty blade. Han Mingyue had seen Mo Xiaoyao at almost every stage. When he was young, he was heroic and radiant, like a blazing sun. When he was young, he was restrained, seemingly gentle and elegant, but in reality, he was cold and indifferent. But the current Mo Xiaoyao, even if he didn't do anything, was enough to make Han Mingyue tremble in fear. That pair of gentle and cold eyes carried a faint scarlet and unconcealed ruthlessness, as if he wanted to tear apart anything he saw at any time. Mo Xiaoyao's thin figure was straighter than usual, but it was filled with a dangerous aura. It made him seem incomparably weak, but also as if he could make the world die with just a raise of his hand. Han Mingxi sneered and said, do you think this young master is afraid of you? Go ahead and kill. You, the country's stabilizing prince, are a peerless genius with unrivaled divine skills. When Jun Wei was guarding the northwest and facing off against Lei Zhenting, what were you doing? When Jun Wei was being chased to the point where she had nowhere to go, what were you doing? When Jun Wei was pregnant and fell off the cliff, what were you doing? Mo Xiaoyao, are you still a man? You trash. Pooh! Han Mingxi's words seemed to have broken through something that had been suppressed since last night. A mouthful of blood was spat out from Mo Xiaoyao's mouth. Feng Zhiyao's doppelganger flew over. Prince. Mo Xiaoyao's face was as white as paper. But he did not fall down, and just stared at Feng Zhiyao. Li is pregnant. Feng Zhiyao's lips moved. There was a sharp pain in his throat, and he could only nod with difficulty. Mo Xiaoyao's expression was both happy and sad, but he could not seem to speak. The dark red blood seemed to be unable to stop flowing down his lips. Deep worry flashed through Feng Zhiyao's eyes. He said in a low voice, Prince, take care of your body. Wang Fei. Wang Fei's great revenge. Feng Zhiyao did not say empty words like maybe Wang Fei would be fine. Something that even he himself did not believe could not convince Mo Xiaoyao. And those people who had harmed Wang Fei. Feng Zhiyao sighed inside. Those people had to die. Otherwise, even Prince would not be able to live. On the edge of the cliff that was not very wide, everyone was silent and did not dare to speak. They were afraid that if they broke the silence, it would bring about an unstoppable and terrifying result. From yesterday until now, the people on the cliff had not eaten or drunk, but now, no one felt hungry or thirsty. Mo Xiaoyao knelt on the ground and reported everything that had happened in the past 2 days in detail to Mo Xiaoyao. At the same time, the other people also learned of the situation at the bottom of the cliff. There was a raging river at the bottom of the cliff. After dawn, the mist had dissipated, and there were no obstacles on the 2 sides of the cliff. In other words, Wang Fei Yili must have fallen into the river. Then the raging water made it impossible to predict where the person who had fallen into the water would be taken to. Feng Zhiyao stood and ordered his subordinates to take a large group of people to search along the river. Han Mingyue carefully looked at the man who seemed to be calmly listening to Han Mingyue's words. The danger under that calmness made Han Mingyue's heart tremble. At this time, Mo Xiaoyao was like a bloodthirsty blade. Even the slightest touch would cause people to bleed. Finally, when Mo Xiaoyao's gaze slowly moved towards Su Zuodi started to sob in fear. She had never realized that Mo Xiaoyao could become so terrifying. Those eyes that she had once been so infatuated with were now as terrifying as a nightmare. When Mo Xiaoyao stood up and walked in front of her, she could only helplessly shake her head. Woo. Xiaoyao. Don't. Let me go, I beg you. Woo. At this moment, Su Zuodi suddenly realized that killing Yili might be the biggest mistake she had made in her life. Woo woo. Don't, I didn't kill Yili. It has nothing to do with me. Chapter 371. Mo Xiaoyao crouched down in front of her and looked closely at her crying face. Under that kind of gaze, Su Zuodi found that she couldn't even cry. After a long time, she heard Mo Xiaoyao ask softly, "You want to use a hidden weapon to kill Lili?" Su Zuodi didn't dare to answer. Mo Xiaoyao clearly had no interest in her answer. He pulled open her sleeve and revealed the hidden weapon tied to her wrist. Storm Pear Blossom Needles. He casually pulled off the box of hidden weapons on her wrist and slowly pressed it down under everyone's gaze. Ah! Su Zuodi's scream rang through the forest. The last Storm Pear Blossom needles in the box shot into Su Zuodi's arm that had been holding the hidden weapon. Her originally fair and beautiful jade arm suddenly became dripping with blood, a tragic sight to behold. Xiaoyao. Han Mingyue couldn't bear to look away. In the end, this was the woman he had loved for more than a decade. He couldn't help but speak. "You want to plead for her?" Mo Xiaoyao looked back at him and said with a cold smile, "Han Mingyue, this time, you can only choose to die with her, or let her die by herself. Seeing that you were injured in order to save Li, I'll let you go." Princess Ding hasn't. Han Mingyue struggled to say something, but any words were empty and powerless in front of Mo Xiaoyao. Even if Li Li is standing here safe and sound, it is not a reason for her to die. But don't worry, I will not let her die so quickly. Feng San, take her to Qin Feng. Qin Feng will know how to use her. Feng Zhiyao nodded silently. For the first time in his life, he felt a thread of sympathy for this woman that he hated. What could Qin Feng's team, which was called Qi Lin by the prince and princess consort, do with a woman who was hated by the prince? Feng Zhiyao knew a little about it. Under the hands of those people, even the toughest person would cry and beg for mercy in less than 3 days. Without Prince's permission, she couldn't even die even if she wanted to. Prince, Lei Jinting has already returned to the northwest with his gold-robed guards. This subordinate has already sent people to pursue them. At the foot of the mountain, how should we deal with the captives? Prince, please advise us. Mo Xiaoyao asked calmly, how many? Feng Zhiyao reported, altogether there are more than 6,500 men, among which there are 7 lieutenants, 3 deputy generals, and 1 general stationed in the city. It's Ruyang Cheng's general, Qi Shaowu. Kill them all. Mo Xiaoyao said indifferently without the slightest hesitation. Feng Zhiyao stilled slightly and quickly reacted. He said in a low voice, this subordinate obeys. Yunzhou Lishan Academy before dawn, Master Qin Yun, who was over 70 years old, held the hand of his youngest grandson as they strolled along the corridor. Su Hongyu's expression was calm as he accompanied his father. Father, why are you up so early? Looking at the dark sky, Su Hongyu's face showed a thread of worry and concern. Master Qin Yun waved his hand and said, it's nothing. I just don't know why I woke up in the middle of the night, but I can't sleep anymore. Su Hongyu thought and said, Father, are you worried about Li? Master Qin Yun sighed and said, Father hasn't seen Li for many years. This child has been different from her mother since she was young. Now, these years, you have suffered. Seeming to think of something, Master Qin Yun looked at his son with a gaze full of love and guilt. If it wasn't for the Su family, if it wasn't for his father's reputation, how could his son only be able to stay in the academy and teach students? Other people struggled because they didn't have a good family background, but Su Hongyu was burdened by his family background. Master Qin Yun knew very well that his eldest son's talent and strategy were not below his. More importantly, his eldest son even had ambitions that he didn't have. Father, what are you saying? I am also a famous scholar. How can you talk about suffering? Master Qin Yun waved his hand and continued to walk forward. He said, how can I not know what you are worried about? The Su family is not blindly loyal to the imperial court and the royal family. Rather, we have no choice but to be loyal. Su Qingyan looked at his grandfather in confusion. Master Qingyun smiled and said, Qingyan, you don't understand. Su Qingyan said respectfully, Grandfather, please enlighten me. Master Qingyun sighed and said, Scholars can cause chaos in the country, but they can't overturn the power. Since ancient times, how many scholars have you seen that overturned the world? This is also why the emperors of the past always valued the civil and despised the military. Because they knew that even if there were traitors among the civil officials, it would be difficult to truly overturn the imperial power. And our Su family can't do that. Hung Yu, when you agreed to the marriage between Li Er and Prince Ding, did you think about the current situation? Su Hongyu was silent for a moment. Finally, he said, Father, please forgive me. I did think about it. Master Qingyun shook his head and said, I'm not saying that you did wrong. The dispute between the royal family and the Ding king's residence can't be avoided. No matter what, this generation will inevitably end, whether it's the Ding king's residence or the current emperor. It's not wrong for you to link the Su family and the Ding king's residence together. Once the Ding king's residence is destroyed, even if the royal family doesn't do anything to the Su family, the only thing waiting for the Su family is withering day by day. Although I'm old, I don't want my children and grandchildren to be as depressed as you and Hong Yan. Su Hongyu was slightly moved. He lowered his head to cover his slightly red eyes and said, I've made you worry, Father. Holding the railing of the corridor, Master Qingyun pointed to the distant sky and sighed, the Emperor's star is dim, the army destroyer's 7 evil spirits are in the sky, and the ominous star in the northwest has appeared, the world is doomed to chaos. Yes, Father. Standing next to his father, Su Hongyu said in a deep voice. He, who was also proficient in astrology, naturally understood everything that Master Qingyun saw. Only Su Qingyan looked at the slightly brightening sky with a blank face and scratched his head. Hongyu, remember, the Su family's family motto has never been to be loyal to a monarch, but, Su Hongyu made an excuse and said, Hongyu understands. The Su family's motto is to govern the world in chaos and save the people from fire and water. Your son doesn't dare to forget. The 10th month of this year was definitely a day that the entire world would remember. For example, Prince Li Mo Jingli joined forces with Nanzhao and Xiling to attack the Dechu state. For example, Prince Ding personally led the 500,000 Mahist army to meet the 3 allied forces. For example, the 16-year-old Princess Ding oversaw the northwest as a daughter. On the 15th and 16th of October, she completely annihilated the Xiling army in Hangzhou, the last line of defense in the northwest of Dechu state. At this point, the 200,000 Xiling army that confronted Princess Ding in the northwest were completely annihilated. Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling fled in panic. When this news spread, the world was shocked. For example, when Princess Ding confronted Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling, she even divided her army into 2 groups. With only 30,000 soldiers and horses, she blocked the valley that Dechu state had to pass through in the northwest. It was difficult to advance or retreat. Princess Ding's personal guard, Qin Feng, led a team of a few dozen people called Qi Lin. They appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Every time the Mahist army attacked or intercepted, Qi Lin would be the vanguard. He was invincible. On the 17th of October, the grain that was escorted by the Xiling reinforcements to Dechu state was burned into a pile of ashes. A huge Qilin flame rose into the sky amidst the flames. At this point, the Qilin became famous after this battle, and the whole world knew about it. The 300,000 Xiling army lost all their grain and had to retreat to the border of Xiling in panic. Mo Jingqi's expression darkened slightly, calmly asking, Elder Su, what do you think? Su Zhe bowed respectfully and said, Your Majesty, King Ding's concubine has been killed. King Ding must be extremely sad and indignant at this time. We can only appease him and not pressure him. Prime Minister Lu turned to look at Su Zhe and said mockingly, "Don't tell me that the 7,000 soldiers died in vain. Elder Su, you are also a scholar. You should understand that if a prince breaks the law, he will be punished the same as a commoner. Besides, this Prince Ding is only your Majesty's subject. We naturally express our deep condolences for Princess Ding's death. Could it be that Princess Ding's life is a life and those 7,000 soldiers are weeds?" These words were indeed dignified, but which one of those who could stand in the imperial court was a bookworm who only knew how to read? A prince breaking the law, he will be punished the same as a commoner. If this rule could really be fulfilled, the domineering Lu family should have been exterminated long ago. Su Zhe looked at Prime Minister Lu and sighed softly. He continued to speak to Mo Jingqi, "Your Majesty, please reconsider. Now that the Dechu state is in chaos, His Highness Prince Ding acted unfairly this time. But now, the Dechu state can't do without His Highness. Your Majesty, please forgive His Highness Prince Ding's mistake." Prime Minister Lu snorted, "Can't do without His Highness Prince Ding? Could it be that all the civil and military officials of the Great Chu dynasty are useless? Could it be that the Great Chu dynasty can't do without Prince Ding?" Su Zhe said lightly, "I've heard that Lord Lu's manor has a general. But I don't know how many soldiers General Lu can lead and what achievements he has. Can he replace Prince Ding to pacify the war in the northwest?" Prime Minister Lu's face turned green and white. Mo Jingqi slapped the table heavily, angrily saying, "Enough. Do you think the imperial court is a place to bicker? All of you, shut up. Pass down my decree. Prince Ding, Mo Xiuyao, killed the innocent without permission. He is deceiving the emperor. Remembering the merits of our ancestors, I pardon his death. Prince Ding will be given the title of duke and his salary will be deducted for 3 years." As soon as he said this, the hall was silent. It took a long time for someone to react. "Your Majesty, please reconsider." "Shut up. I've made up my mind." The news from the imperial court quickly spread to the imperial harem. Empress Hua was originally receiving the worship of the concubines and the madams. When she heard the news from her trusted maid, she couldn't help but feel dizzy. Her body swayed, but she finally sat firm. She waved her hand to let the concubines and madams who didn't know what had happened leave. Then she asked in a low voice, "Is this true?" The maid said in a low voice, "The news just came from the imperial court. I'm afraid that the emperor's decree has already left the capital." The empress weakly fell back into the phoenix chair, murmuring in a low voice, "He's crazy. Princess Ding. Princess Ding." The maid said, "Our family has also received the news. I'm afraid that Princess Ding's life is in danger." The empress thought of the gentle woman she had seen several times. She looked gentle and graceful, but always had a feeling of intimacy and a calming aura. That woman stunned the world on the northwest battlefield, but the next moment, she withered away. Sure enough. Heaven was jealous of her beauty. Very quickly, the empress regained her composure. Restraining the expression on her face, she said, "Personally leave the palace and meet with my father. Tell him that the Hua family is of utmost importance. There is no need to worry about I." The maid hesitantly looked at the empress. The empress waved her hand and said, "Go. Father will understand my intentions." The maid worriedly withdrew. Only then did the empress lean against the phoenix chair and deeply sigh. Her beautiful face was filled with worry and helplessness. Imperial Mother. Princess Changel ran into the hall with small steps. Seeing the exhausted expression on her mother's face, she worriedly asked, "Imperial Mother, what's wrong? Did something happen?" The empress pulled Princess Changel into her embrace, gently patting her back and softly saying, "It's nothing. Nothing will happen. Good child. Imperial Mother will arrange everything for you." Although the empress was unwilling to speak clearly, Princess Changle knew in her heart that something big must have happened. Obediently leaning into the empress's embrace, she said, "Changle will also protect Imperial Mother. Changle wants Imperial Mother and Changle to be safe and sound together." Good child. Hangzhou City. Although it was still the governor's residence, the atmosphere was completely different. Unlike Xinyang, other than a few city gates, Hangzhou City's losses were negligible. What caused people to tremble with fear was the bloody battle that had lasted for 1 day and 1 night. By the time the reinforcements arrived at Hangzhou City, the original 30,000 Mahist army had been reduced to a little more than 10,000 soldiers. As for the 70,000 Shilling soldiers, they had been reduced to less than 30,000 soldiers. The entire city reeked of blood. With every step, the ground would be stained with dark red blood. The corpses were quickly removed and disposed of. The blood-stained streets were quickly cleaned up. Apart from the faint smell of blood that permeated the air, everything seemed to have returned to how it had been before the great battle. However, on the city gate tower, within the governor's residence, there was no longer that seemingly leisurely blue-clothed woman who made people feel at ease. As for the other leader of the Mahist army, he was still in a deep sleep, unconscious. Chapter 373. In the deepest courtyard of the governor's manor, Feng Zhiyao was restlessly pacing back and forth in his room. Looking at Xinyang, who was sitting by the bed taking his pulse, he asked irritably, "Mr. Shen, when will the prince wake up?" Ever since that day when he came down from the mountain, Mo Xiaoyao's body, which was not healthy to begin with, could not take the stress and fatigue of the past few days. He spat out a few mouthfuls of blood and fell off the back of the horse. From then on, he did not wake up. But the people searching for the Wangfei did not dare to stop. Feng Zhiyao sent out tens of thousands of people every day to follow the river downstream and even upstream to search. But after 7 or 8 days, there was still no news. Feng Zhiyao knew in his heart that there really was no hope. Xinyang turned his head to look at him and shook his head. Feng Zhiyao rushed forward and grabbed him. "What do you mean by shaking your head?" Xinyang said, "When the prince will wake up, it is not up to me to decide." Feng Zhiyao laughed dryly. "What do you mean? You're not telling me that the prince doesn't want to live anymore?" Xinyang shook his head. "That's not it. If the prince really wants to die, then he does not deserve to be Mo Liufang's son. What I'm saying is that the prince's body does not allow him to wake up. The poison in his body has not been cleared, his body is weak and he has been sick for a long time. Now he has reached an extremely dangerous point. Once His Highness wakes up, he will definitely be enraged. There is no need for him to think of anything. His body will completely collapse." Feng Zhiyao did not care about his demeanor. He angrily grabbed his hair and said, "Then what should we do now? I can hold on for 2 or 3 days, 10 days to half a month. If the prince does not wake up after a long time, what will we do? What will the Mahist army do? What will the Northwest do?" Xinyang rolled his eyes and expressionlessly said, "I am a doctor. If you ask me, who will I ask? Mo Xiaoyao hasn't woken up yet." Han Mingxi walked in with a solemn expression, glancing at the person on the bed. Feng Zhiyao frowned and looked at him. "Young Master Han, please conduct yourself with dignity." Han Mingxi sneered. "Conduct myself with dignity? Respect my ass. When something happened to Li Li, he just lay in bed and pretended to be dead. Get out of the way." Feng Zhiyao stood in front of him and said in a low voice, "Young Master Han, I respect you as a good friend of the princess consort and will give you some leeway. Don't be ungrateful." Han Mingxi was so angry that he laughed. "You still remember your princess consort? How rare. Mo Xiaoyao, if you can still breathe, then get up for me. Jun Wei is truly unlucky to have met you." Feng Zhiyao still wanted to speak, but he was stopped by Xinyang who was standing to the side. Xinyang shook his head and signaled to Feng Zhiyao to stand to the side and not interfere. Han Mingxi snorted and walked to the side of the bed to look down at the man whose face was as white as paper. No matter how he looked at him, he was not pleasing to the eye. If it wasn't for this man, would Jun Wei, a young lady from a noble family, need to risk her life on the battlefield? Would she need to be forced to the point where she couldn't even properly recover after being pregnant? All of this was caused by Mo Xiuyao's incompetence. You continue to sleep. Sleep until you die. This young master will take revenge for Jun Wei. Humph. Coward, idiot, trash. Feng Zhiyao stared dumbfoundedly at Han Mingyue, who used all the curses he knew to scold Mo Xiuyao from the beginning to the end without any pause. Feng Zhiyao's expression was stiff and he didn't know how to react. Heavens above, no one had scolded the Prince of Ding Country since the establishment of the Ding Country's royal residence. It seemed that he had finally vented the anger that had been suppressed in his heart for the past few days. Han Mingxi's complexion was obviously much better. He cast a glance at Mo Xiuyao and snorted, "If you want to play dead, then continue to play dead. This young master won't serve you anymore." After that, he left like a gust of wind. Feng Zhiyao blinked his eyes and looked at Shen Yang with empty eyes. Shen Yang looked at the person on the bed, shook his head and turned to leave. Early in the morning, Feng Zhiyao was anxiously called by the guards to Mo Xiuyao's courtyard. There was no other reason. When the guards who served the prince in the morning entered the door, they discovered that the person who was supposed to be unconscious on the bed had disappeared. Under the protection of hundreds of shadow guards and the protection of hundreds of thousands of Mahist army inside and outside the city, the prince had actually disappeared without a trace. This made everyone panic. Rushing into the courtyard, Feng Zhiyao couldn't care about anything else as he kicked open the half-closed door and rushed in. However, he was stunned by the scene in front of him. In the room where the prince had supposedly disappeared, the bed was still empty. But there was a thin and tall figure standing by the window in the side hall. What shocked Feng Zhiyao was the blinding white hair behind the figure. Prince! Prince! Coming back to his senses, Feng Zhiyao shouted towards the door. Invite Mr. Shen over. Mo Xiuyao turned his head and looked at the person in front of him. Feng Zhiyao felt his heart ache. The silver hair casually fell around Mo Xiuyao's neck and made the already thin person appear even thinner and paler. But his mental state seemed to be unusually good. He did not have the situation that Shen Yang had predicted would cause his body to break down due to his rage. In Feng Zhiyao's view, his body seemed to be much better than before Wang Fei's accident. However, there was now a sharp glint in his eyes, which were originally warm and cold. Feng Zhiyao couldn't help but think of the blood-quenching knife light. It seemed that there was a terrifying beast hidden under that calmness. If one day it broke out. Feng Zhiyao's heart trembled and he didn't dare to think further. Prince! Prince, are you all right? The corners of Mo Xiuyao's lips lifted slightly, but Feng Zhiyao couldn't feel the slightest hint of a smile. He only heard him ask coolly, "How many days have I slept?" Feng Zhiyao's heart trembled. 9 days. Is there any news of Li? Feng Zhiyao lowered his head and said in a low voice, Wang Fei has great fortune, she will definitely turn misfortune into fortune. Then it is useless. Mo Xiuyao said coolly. Great fortune, turn misfortune into fortune. I do not believe in ghosts or gods, and do not pray to the heavens. If she dies, I will turn this world into a purgatory, and use the mountains and rivers as a sacrifice for her. Feng Zhiyao's heart shook and he shook his head in defeat. If Mo Xiuyao was mad, depressed, or grieving, what could he say to comfort him? But facing the man who calmly said such shocking words, he could not say anything. He did not know what to say, or rather, he did not dare. The room was silent. After a long time, Mo Xiuyao said, Tell I about Li Li. Feng Zhiyao didn't know what to say, but he had no choice but to say it. Thus, he recounted everything that had happened since Mo Xiuyao left. He recalled everything that had happened in detail. When he could not avoid mentioning the child that was almost 2 months old, Feng Zhiao silently glanced at the silver-haired man by the window. Other than seeing his hand tightly gripping the window frame in front of him, there was not a ripple on his calm face. Shenyang hurriedly came in with a medicine box. Feng Zhiao immediately closed his mouth and moved to the side of the door. Shenyang stood at the door and stilled when he saw the person by the window. It was clear that the situation in front of him was not within his expectations. It was not that a person's hair turned white overnight had not been recorded before, but to see it with his own eyes was another matter. On the other hand, Shenyang somewhat understood why Mo Xiuyao could stand on his own after waking up so quickly, and not lie in bed with an even weaker body. The anger, resentment, pain, and grief in his heart did not leave even when he was unconscious, which was why his hair turned white. But in the end, it was released. As long as Prince Ding did not overindulge his temper and emotions, he was temporarily safe. As long as there was time, he would find a way to completely cure him. Thinking of this, Shenyang let out a sigh of relief. He walked forward and said in a low voice, "Prince, please allow this one to take your pulse." Chapter 374. Mo Xiuyao did not object. He casually sat down on a chair by the window and placed his wrist on the table. Shenyang stepped forward to check his pulse. He looked at Mo Xiuyao with some confusion and frowned. "Prince's body is fine for now. However, I ask that Prince not be too tired. Take care." "Thank you for your trouble, Mr. Shen." Mo Xiuyao nodded. This time, Shenyang also noticed that something was wrong with Mo Xiuyao. Mo Xiuyao was not a patient that was hard to take care of, but he was definitely not a patient that would listen to a doctor's advice. Seeing how seriously Mo Xiuyao was listening to his advice, for some reason, made him feel uneasy. "These days, Prince. I'm afraid his mental state has been hurt. This one will prescribe some medicine. Prince, take it as a hint." "I understand." Mo Xiuyao nodded. He thought for a moment and lifted the white hair on his shoulder to take a look. "I ask Mr. Shen to help me prepare some medicine to cover up my white hair." Shenyang paused and nodded. This subordinate obeys. Reporting to Prince, an envoy from the capital. The guard outside the door reported. Mo Xiuyao lowered his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. "Let him in." "This one, Assistant Minister Lu Tsongyun, greets Your Highness Prince Ding." This time, the envoy who came to deliver the decree was clearly different from the previous unlucky official. At least, just from the extravagance, it was clear that the two were completely different. An assistant minister of the Ministry of Appointments from the Lu clan was accompanied by several generals. Not to mention the 3,000 elite soldiers and a few hundred guards who were blocked outside the city. Feng Zhiao, who was standing to the side, tugged at the corners of his lips. A mocking smile flashed in his eyes. What did Mo Jingqi mean by this? On the seat, Mo Xiuyao's face was still somewhat pale. However, it was impossible to tell that he was still lying unconscious on the bed. His white hair also returned to its original black color with the potion provided by Shenyang. Coupled with the faint smile on his handsome face, Mo Xiuyao really didn't look like a man whose beloved wife had just fallen off a cliff and disappeared. Lu Tsongyun looked at Prince Ding, who was seated, and frowned slightly. She felt a little uneasy because of Prince Ding's unexpected behavior. Therefore, even though he came with the order to reprimand Mo Xiuyao, he still respectfully went up to greet him. "Lord Lu, please don't stand on ceremony." Mo Xiuyao smiled calmly and pointed to the seat beside him. "Lord Lu, please sit." Lu Tsongyun looked somewhat cautiously at Mo Xiuyao. She couldn't see any emotion in his calm and deep eyes. She could only stand and thank him. She sat down beside Mo Xiuyao. Mo Xiuyao glanced at Feng Zhiao. Feng Zhiao smiled and sat down opposite Lu Tsongyun. Not long after, the general stationed in Hangzhou City also arrived and sat down. Lu Songyun looked at the situation in front of her and her smile stiffened. Mo Xiaoyao leisurely put down his teacup and smiled at Lu Songyun. Lord Lu, I haven't been feeling well recently and couldn't personally welcome the saint at the city gates. Please forgive me. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao smile so amiably, Lu Songyun felt her hair stand on end. She hurriedly smiled and said, Prince is joking. The princess consorts matter. The princess consort is a unique woman. Heaven helps the worthy. Prince, please do not worry. Mo Xiaoyao stilled slightly and then quickly smiled. He nodded and said, Lord Lu is right. Princess Li is truly a unique woman. Feng Zhiyao also had a relaxed smile as he praised Princess Consort for her virtue, talent and beauty, and how she had led the Mahist army to defeat the Shiling army. Lu Songyun could only smile and praise Yi Li's merits. For a moment, she didn't know how to speak. Fortunately, Mo Xiaoyao did not sit here to have people praise his princess consort. Before Lu Songyun could continue, he calmly changed the topic. I remember that Lord Lu is the grandson of Prime Minister Lu. Will Prime Minister Lu come in? Lu Songyun replied cautiously, Grandfather is healthy and often misses Prince's hard work on the campaign. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and said, I also learned much from Prime Minister Lu when I was young. I is also very gratified that the old Prime Minister is healthy. Right, for the Emperor to send Lord Lu, the future patriarch of the Lu family, there must be an important matter. I hope that I do not have a personal matter with Lord Lu. Lu Songyun didn't dare to say it. He felt a slight bitterness in his mouth. At this moment, the atmosphere was so good that he didn't know how to take out the Emperor's decree. If Mo Xiaoyao hadn't taken the initiative to ask, he might not have found a chance to announce it until the end. Of course, he could have just announced the decree as soon as he arrived, but Lu Songyun was the eldest grandson of the Lu family. He had been raised as the future head of the family since he was young. He was not someone ordinary people could compare to. Lu Songyun didn't believe that there was nothing fishy about Wang Jingchuan's death. He also understood Wang Jingchuan's personality and conduct. Thus, he was even more careful about this task that he didn't want to do. He didn't dare to show any arrogance in front of Prince Ding. Standing up, Lu Songyun raised his hands in salute to Mo Xiaoyao and said, This official has indeed brought the Emperor's decree. Would Your Highness Prince Ding please accept the decree? Mo Xiaoyao smiled in response, but he didn't show any intention of moving from his chair. Not to mention getting up to greet him, he didn't even have the intention to sit up straight to show his respect. It wasn't just Mo Xiaoyao. Even the general sitting below didn't show any intention of moving. Lu Songyun's lips twitched. He pretended not to see anything. He had come to announce the decree, not to protect the Emperor's dignity. As long as he could return to the capital alive, he could complain to the Emperor however he wanted. However, the prerequisite was that he could return alive after reading the decree. Lu Songyun turned his head and took the bright yellow cloth from the box from the attendant beside him. He unfolded it and read in a clear voice, By the will of the heavens, the Emperor decrees, Prince Ding, Mo Xiaoyao, has willfully murdered the innocent. He has deceived the Emperor. Jin remembers the merits of our ancestors and pardons his death sentence. Prince Ding will be conferred the title of Junwang, and his salary will be forfeited for 3 years. The hall was completely silent. Lu Songyun could clearly feel the unfriendly gazes of the people around him. He also felt the faint traces of sweat in his hands as he held the decree. Doing his best to appear calm and composed, Lu Songyun closed the bright yellow cloth and walked forward. Prince Ding, please accept the decree. Mo Xiaoyao gently waved his sleeve and the bright yellow decree landed in his hand. Mo Xiaoyao opened it and looked at the familiar handwriting on it. His handsome eyes narrowed slightly. He seemed to be deep in thought for a long time. The smile on his lips became more obvious and made people feel even colder. Feng Zhiyao, who was sitting closest to him, squeezed himself deeper into his chair. The other generals all looked down and pretended not to see anything. Demoted, to Junwang, forfeited for 3 years. Mo Xiuyao's voice quietly sounded in the hall. There seemed to be a strange smile in his voice. Is this what the emperor wants to say? Lu Tsongyun's heart broke out in cold sweat. He respectfully said, reporting to Prince Ding, the emperor doesn't have any other intentions. It's just that, the emperor has to give the people of the world an explanation for this matter. Chapter 375. Mo Xiuyao raised an eyebrow and said with a smile, did the emperor not mention the military power of the Mahist army? King Ding's manor, no. King Ding's manor clearly has more subordinates than King Ding's manor. Lu Tsongyun's heart jumped. The emperor had indeed mentioned this and hinted that it would be best if he could take it back from Prince Ding. He had even promised that he would promote him to Minister of Appointments. However, in Lu Tsongyun's heart, she had no intention of mentioning this to Prince Ding. Compared to the position of minister that he would get sooner or later, it was more important to not anger Prince Ding and return alive. Even though the Lu family had always been loyal to the emperor, in Lu Tsongyun's mind, it was much easier to ask the emperor for forgiveness than to anger Prince Ding. Forcing a smile, Lu Tsongyun said, the emperor's decree did not mention this. This lowly official does not dare to guess the emperor's will. I think the emperor has his own decision. Mo Xiuyao nodded and said in agreement, official Lu's words are very reasonable. Logically speaking, the emperor has already sent down the edict to demote me. As officials, we should tactfully hand over those things. However, there is no choice, the things in I's hands are not convenient to hand over. However, the title of Prince Ding can be returned to the emperor. Can official Lu go back and tell the emperor that whether I am a prince or a Junwang, I do not care. In exchange for keeping the Mahist army and the Mo family's ancestral businesses, I can have all of my titles removed. How about that? Lu Tsongyun's expression changed. He naturally understood the meaning of Mo Xiuyao's words. Mo Xiuyao did not care whether he was Prince Ding or not. Even if he was a commoner, the Mahist army would only listen to Mo Xiuyao. The businesses of the Prince Ding mansion would still only be managed by Mo Xiuyao. The so-called position of Prince Ding was just an empty title. If Mo Xiuyao wanted to, he could even give himself the title of king. Prince, please calm down. His Majesty has no such intention, Mo Xiuyao sneered, that's not what I meant. Then, may I ask Sir Lu what's going on with the 600,000 soldiers that you've secretly mobilized at Feihong Pass, which is 60 li away from Ruyang City? In the south, Mo Jingli, Nanzhao, and the Xiling army are advancing towards the northwest without any hindrance. What is this all about? This lowly official did not know. Please forgive me, Prince. Lu Tsongyun was shocked. She did not expect Prince Ding to know so clearly about these secret troop movements. Furthermore, he even knew the exact number of people who were present. Seeing his pale face, Mo Xiuyao comforted him apologetically, Lord Lu, don't worry. This time, I will definitely let you return safely. By the way, please go back and tell Marquis Muyang that he has 2 good sons, but it's a pity that he's too good at ruining them. Seeing that Muyang is a filial son, I will let you bring Muyang back with you. As for Marquis Muyang, let him wait in Ruyang City. I will definitely take his life. Prince. Lu Tsongyun did not know what else to say. Mo Xiuyao smiled, of course, the premise is that Marquis Muyang is still alive when Sir Lu gets back. Prince, what do you mean? Lu Tsongyun asked stiffly. Mo Xiuyao tilted his head and smiled, the Mahist army is united in their desire to capture the culprit who caused I's beloved concubine and their mistress' disappearance to avenge her. I am very touched and cannot refuse the loyalty of the soldiers. Am I right, Lord Lu? Lu Tsongyun's expression changed greatly. Inwardly, he sucked in a breath of cold air and felt a heart-wrenching pain. When he had entered the city, he had seen some movement of troops, but he had thought that it was to defend against the Shilling reinforcements and the three-way coalition army that was coming from the pass. He had not thought that Prince Ding was going to take Ruyang. Prince, please reconsider. Right now, the Dechu state is in chaos. Prince, please prioritize the Dechu state. The corners of Mo Xiuyao's eyes rose slightly. He looked at him with seeming mockery and puzzlement. Prioritize the country. What is that? Lu Tsongyun almost spat out a mouthful of blood. For the prince who had protected the Dechu state for generations to say such words, it really made people spit blood. On the side, Feng Zhiyao's mouth couldn't help but twitch. He hurriedly suppressed it. Had the prince learned this from Wang Fei? This was clearly Wang Fei's style of speaking. Thinking of a certain person whose life and death were unknown, his originally curved lips gradually sank. Lu Tsongyun said in a low voice, Prince, the Ding royal estate has protected the Dechu state for generations. Prince, you must not destroy the Ding royal estate and the Dechu state because of a moment of anger. Mo Xiuyao nonchalantly raised his tea and said, Oh. The Dechu state's country. Isn't that Mo Jingqi's matter? As for the Ding royal estate that has protected the Dechu state for generations. I am no longer Prince Ding, but Prince Ding. Perhaps in a few days, I will be an ordinary commoner. Lu Tsongyun tried her best to persuade him, but he didn't seem to care at all. In the end, Lu Tsongyun could only helplessly leave with his men. He had to immediately return to the capital and report this news to the emperor. Seeing Lu Tsongyun leave in a hurry, Mo Xiuyao did not stop him. Lowering his head to look at the imperial edict in his hand, he lightly snorted and flung the bright yellow silk to a corner of the hall. Feng Zhiyao stood up and said with a smile, Prince, even if you don't like it, there is no need to throw it away. The cloth with the imperial edict is made from the best silk, the best dyers, and the best weavers. Ordinary people will never be able to touch a piece of it in their lifetime. Mo Xiuyao nodded and agreed, that's reasonable. Then let's hang it on the city gates and let the passing commoners feast their eyes on it. Feng Zhiyao put away the silk on the ground and looked at Mo Xiuyao, asking, Prince, are we really letting Lu Tsongyun and Mu Yang leave like this? The generals present all looked at Mo Xiuyao. It was clear that they also had doubts about this decision. Mo Xiuyao smiled. Of course, why not? Lu Tsongyun, this person, is smarter than his father and grandfather. He has already compromised so much. If this prince still makes a move against him, wouldn't people think that this prince is narrow-minded? Of course, Lu Tsongyun was also more ambitious than his father and grandfather. Mo Jingqi had raised such a flexible subject who had the support of such a large family. I want to see, even without King Ding's residence, how will you maintain the harmony between the ruler and his subjects? Then Mu Yang. At the mention of Mu Yang, Feng Zhiyao could not help but grit his teeth. It was not that he had a problem with Mu Yang, but Mu Yang's father, Marquis Mu Yang. This time, although Marquis Mu Yang did not personally lead the troops when the princess consort was being chased by Dechu state's troops, he was the one who commanded them. Similarly, they were also clear about the contents of the imperial edict Marquis Mu Yang received from Mo Jingqi. Under such circumstances, even if Mu Yang was killed, it was a logical thing to do. Thus, Feng Zhiyao could not understand why Prince wanted to release Mu Yang to Marquis Mu Yang. A cold glint flashed in Mo Xiuyao's eyes as he said mildly, I still have use for Mu Yang. As for Marquis Mu Yang, tell your men to be careful. Don't let him die on the battlefield. Seeing that Mo Xiuyao clearly had his own plans, Feng Zhiyao did not ask further. It was just that when he raised his head and saw a flash of red light from Mo Xiuyao, Feng Zhiyao silently lamented for Marquis Mu Yang in his heart. Being targeted by the prince, dying on the battlefield was actually the best ending for Marquis Mu Yang, right? Chapter 376. Mo Xiuyao stood up, the faint smile on his face turning into a solemn and serious expression. The generals who had been sitting immediately stood up in unison and respectfully listened to the prince's orders. Mo Xiaoyao gazed into the distance at the blue sky outside the hall. His voice was hollow and solemn. Order the entire army, all the tribes fighting with Nanzhao and Xiling to retreat. Move closer to Ruyang. With Feihong Pass as the boundary, I want to see all the Mahist army gathered in 10 days. Yes, Prince. Everyone accepted the order. They did not have any doubts about this decision. Feng Zhiyao stepped out and asked, Prince, the court troops in Ruyang, expel them all. Kill those who do not obey. In the 10th month of the 12th year of Emperor Jing's reign in Dechu State, Princess Ding had defeated Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling and Princess Ding in succession. At the end of the month, the Mahist army that had been fighting with Xiling, Nanzhao, and King Li in various parts of Dechu State quietly retreated, leaving behind the stunned troops and the leaders of the 3 allied forces who were hesitating whether it was a trap or if the Mahist army had truly retreated. When they confirmed that the Mahist army had completely retreated from the battlefield, the overjoyed allied forces did not hesitate to charge toward the rich lands of Dechu State. Even Xiling, who had been defeated in the northwest, did not hesitate to send reinforcements to eastern Chu. However, this time, they tactfully avoided the land in the northwest that was completely controlled by the Mahist army. Instead, they circled around to the south and then went north. At the same time, the northern tribes' army on the northern border began to move. If not for the fact that winter was not suitable for war and they wanted to see the attitude of the Mahist army, the north of Dechu State would have started fighting again before the smoke of war had died out in the south. Naturally, the emperor was furious about this. That day, he issued an edict to the world. Prince Ding, Mo Xiaoyao, was unrepentant and resentful. He withdrew his troops to Dechu State without permission and did not care about the country. He will be stripped of his title, stripped of his military power, and sent back to the capital for further punishment. In response to this decree, Mo Xiaoyao only smiled faintly, then casually crumpled it into a ball and tossed it into an unknown corner. The 100,000 elite soldiers of the Mahist army obeyed the prince's orders and charged toward all the cities within Feihong Pass at lightning speed. The Dechu State soldiers guarding the city naturally did not dare to surrender the city to the enemy, so they rose up in resistance. The battle in the northwest of the Dechu State spread from outside the Great Pass to inside the Great Pass. However, last time, it was the Mahist army protecting the Dechu State fighting the invading Xiling army. This time, it was a battle with the Dechu State's troops. Mo Jingqi issued a series of edicts, reprimanding Mo Xiaoyao for deceiving the emperor, committing treason, etc. For a moment, the world was in an uproar. Then, the person standing in the middle of this storm was standing at the edge of a cliff in the stopped Cloud Mountain range, gazing at the empty wilderness in the distance. That direction was where the flames of war were raging and blood was raining. Then, there was no sympathy or pity in those calm eyes. Prince Su Qingze and Feng Zhiyao walked out of the forest and bowed to the man who was lost in thought standing at the edge of the cliff. Mo Xiaoyao turned his head and saw Su Qingze's gaze waver slightly. He said, Qingze, is there any news of Li? A trace of sadness flashed across Su Qingze's cold and stern handsome face. He said in a low voice, not yet. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and didn't say much. He only said, continue to search. It's been hard on you. It had already been a month since Yi Li fell off the cliff, but none of them were willing to give up the search. Previously, after the 2 people who were responsible for leading troops to search for Yi Li were punished by Mo Xiaoyao, Su Qingze put down the matters that he originally needed to handle and took the initiative to take on this responsibility. And they all knew that Su Qingze definitely wouldn't be negligent in the search for Yi Li. It was just that before they saw Yi Li, none of them were willing to accept the fact that they didn't want to admit. Feng Zhiyao said in a low voice, Prince, these days, Mo Jingqi has issued several edicts to slander Prince's reputation. Shouldn't we do something? Mo Xiaoyao said indifferently, before we take down Fei Hong Pass this year, we don't need to do anything else. But Feng Zhiyao said disapprovingly, in this way, the reputation of the people towards Prince and the Prince Ding mansion will be greatly affected. I just received news from the Shadow Guard. The people in the capital and many other places seem to have been confused by Mo Jingqi's edicts. They are prejudiced against the prince and the Mahist army. Mo Xiaoyao smiled coldly and said, so what? The views of the people are just tools that the people in power can control. Didn't Mo Jingqi always think that the Ding king's residence was a hindrance to him, hindering his great ambition of becoming a mighty ruler? Now, I will give him a chance to throw away the obstruction of the Ding mansion and the Mahist army. Let's see what ability he has to turn the tide and achieve his great ambition. Feng Zhiyao frowned slightly and said, Prince, then we. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly, the Mahist army, temporarily stop at Fei Hong Pass. Next spring, lead the troops to the west. Feng San, I want this world to be in chaos. Don't they like to fight? Then no one should think about being idle. Feng Zhiyao's heart trembled. He suddenly remembered the man in front of him with a head of white hair and his indifferent and emotionless words that morning. He really wanted to drag the world into the flames of war, using the mountains and rivers as a sacrifice. The departure of that gentle woman had probably become a scar in the prince's heart that could never be erased. In the winter of Emperor Jing's 12th year, the Mahist army occupied Fei Hong Pass and expelled all the Dechu state troops stationed in Fei Hong Pass. Those who resisted were killed without mercy. In the spring of Emperor Jing's 13th year, the northern tribes' cavalry also began to stir at the border of Dechu state. At this time, Mo Xiaoyao, who was already in Ruyang City, did not react at all. Instead, he gave another order. He ordered Lu Jingxian and Zhang Qilan to be the left and right marshals. They each led 200,000 troops to attack the border of Xiling. This news seemed to give a signal to everyone. At the beginning of February, the 300,000 northern tribes' cavalry officially knocked on the border of Dechu state. Nanzhao once again sent 200,000 troops to suppress Dechu state. Xiling was also in a state of chaos because of the Mahist army's decision. However, Xiling was still a powerful country that could stand side by side with Dechu state. At this time, Genom of Gojoseon ordered another 500,000 troops to the border. The troops led by Genom of Gojoseon's crown prince Leitengfeng, who had originally been in Dechu state, had no intention of withdrawing from Dechu state. Clearly, they were not willing to give up the benefits they had already obtained in Dechu state. It seemed that in a short period of time, the world had really been thrown into chaos. At the time, it was difficult for people to truly understand the situation. It was not until countless years later, when this period of history had been buried in the annals of history, that the meddlesome historians and scholars were surprised to discover that every change seemed to be vaguely related to the man who had supposedly only made the decision to lead the troops to Xiling. People also clearly discovered that all these changes originated from the 7,000 Dechu state soldiers who had died at the foot of Mount Tingyun. On that same day, the Ding princess who had personally led 200,000 Mahist army to wipe out the Xiling army and plotted to stop the 300,000 reinforcements from Xiling fell off the cliff and disappeared. Scholars and literati often recited poems and wrote their own conjectures here. There were also countless charming and romantic legends circulating among the people. There were even some who listed the Ding princess as one of the top 10 femme fatale in history. This also made Princess Ding of Yili the only legendary woman to be listed as a female general, an extraordinary woman, a beautiful woman, a virtuous empress, and a femme fatale in history. This war that had lasted for several years and engulfed the four countries was also called the Hangzhou Incident because it had originated from Genom of Gojoseon's defeat in Hangzhou. What circulated among the people was an even more beautiful and legendary name, the city toppling chaos. As for how many stories of love and hate had evolved into, there were even more legends. Chapter 377. The armies of the three countries were pressuring the border. Among them was Mo Jingli from Jiangnan. Even though Mo Jingqi hated Mo Xiuyao, he could not spare any energy to target him. Every night, Mo Jingqi regretted being too impulsive and creating a situation where he could neither advance nor retreat. He knew that he had completely pushed the Mahist army and Mo Xiuyao to their limits. From now on, the Mahist army would no longer be the strongest barrier and protector of the Dechu state. Instead, they would be the most dangerous enemy. Right now, he could not even deal with Mo Xiuyao because he could not even protect himself. As Prince Ding, he knew that the appetites of the neighboring countries could not be satisfied just by ceding a city or land. However, he had always thought that as long as he did not have the Ding king's household, he would be able to make the Dechu state powerful in a short period of time and conquer the surrounding countries. However, when the Ding king's household really left, he found that the other countries would not give him the chance to become powerful. Send an edict to Mo Jingli. Tell him that I agree to him dividing the river to rule. Also, let him recognize who the true enemy is. This official accepts the order. In Ruyang City, Feng Zhiyao looked at the indifferent and leisurely man in front of him. A trace of worry quietly rose in his eyes. 4 months had passed. Mo Xiuyao seemed to have gradually recovered from his Wang Fei's disappearance. At least, he was not as lost in thought as he had been in the past 2 months. But at the same time, that increasingly indifferent expression made Feng Zhiyao feel faintly uneasy. Right now, it seemed that the entire world knew that the Ding king's household and the Dechu state had turned against each other. No, in the eyes of the world, the Ding king's household had already betrayed the Dechu state. But he could not see Mo Xiuyao's thoughts and plans for the future. Right now, Mo Xiuyao was more like an outsider watching a play. He sat idly in Ruyang City and watched the world fall into chaos. The West Hill was the strongest, so he sent troops to attack the West Hill. The northern tribes were worried that the Mahist army would interfere in the war with the Dechu state. He ordered all the Mahist army to retreat to Feihong Pass. Even the news that Mo Jingqi wanted to join forces with Mo Jingli did not move him in the slightest. Looking at the letter in his hand, he smiled faintly. Mo Jingqi is too weak, there's nothing wrong with having one more person to play with him. Otherwise, when the time comes, I won't be able to continue playing. Prince, someone from Yunzhou has arrived, Feng Zhiyao reported in a low voice. Mo Xiuyao was startled. He sat up and frowned. What happened to the Su family and Mr. Qingyun? Feng Zhiyao shook his head and said, no, although someone from the Chu capital did mention the relationship between the prince and the Su family, he was persuaded by many ministers. Also, with the reputation of Mr. Qingyun and the Su family, Mo Jingqi would not dare to touch them easily. Mo Xiuyao was slightly relieved. Feng Zhiyao frowned and asked, since the prince is worried about the Su family's safety, why not bring them to Ruyang? Mo Xiuyao shook his head and remained silent. Feng Zhiyao looked at him for a long time before saying, the prince has never planned for the future, has he? That's why he doesn't want to see the Su family come to Ruyang. He's just afraid that one day the prince. Feng San. Mo Xiuyao called him and looked at him steadily. Feng Zhiyao waved his sleeve and said, forget it, do as you see fit. In any case, the lives of hundreds of thousands of Mahist army brothers and their families are in your hands. After saying this, he turned and left. Looking at his departing figure, Mo Xiuyao frowned deeply and muttered in a low voice, hundreds of thousands of Mahist army, so tiring. Feng San, how many years can I take care of them? Father King, big brother, you were also very tired back then. Not long after, someone walked in. Seeing Mo Xiuyao sitting there in a daze, the person didn't say anything and just stood at the door looking at him. Mo Xiuyao frowned and raised his head to look at the person, but was startled. He stood up and looked at the person. After a long time, he said in a low voice, Mr. Su, why are you here? The person took off the felt hat on his head and said with a faint smile, is the prince not welcoming me? Mo Xiuyao shook his head and said, Mr. Su, please sit. What has Mr. Su come for? Su Hongyu looked him up and down and then said, on the way to Ruyang, I originally thought that when I saw the prince would either be bedridden or drinking to drown his sorrows. Mo Xiaoyao was somewhat surprised and said, why does Mr. Su say this? Su Hongyu smiled faintly and said, the prince has entered Ruyang. The Maoist army now controls 5 prefectures and 19 cities, including the northwest. Although it is only 1/10 of Dechu State's territory, it is not smaller than Nanzhao. But the prince, what did I see on the way here? The people's livelihood has withered and the people are barely able to get by. If it weren't for the fact that the Maoist army's area of control is currently the safest place, how many people does the prince think there would be in these places? Mo Xiaoyao was silent. Su Hongyu didn't wait for him to reply and continued, before I came, my father told me that with the prince's talent, you can pacify the country and your military might can stabilize the country. You are definitely not inferior to the regent Mo Lufang or even the first prince Ding Mo Lanyun. Mo Xiaoyao smiled bitterly and said, many thanks for Mr. Qingyun's praise. I fear that I am not worthy of Mr. Qingyun's high praise. A person who can't even protect his wife and children, how can he stabilize the country? Su Hongyu was startled. When he thought of his intelligent and gentle niece, his eyes dimmed. Yi Li was the only daughter of this generation of the Su family. Toward this niece who was even more intelligent and decisive than a man, Su Hongyu truly regarded her as his own daughter and doted on her and taught her. Not only because of his younger sister who died young, but also because Yi Li herself was worth it. Then, this intelligent girl left behind a victory that even a man might not be able to achieve. After that, she suddenly met with such a disaster. She was even younger than her mother by several years. Was the heavens really jealous of her beauty? Carefully looking at the man in front of him who had a calm expression, but whose eyes faintly revealed coldness and boundless hatred, Su Hongyu suddenly laughed out loud. He stared at Mo Xiaoyao and said, Prince's actions today, could it be that it's because of Li Er? What an infatuated person. I'm sure Li Er would be very gratified if she knew in the underworld. Mr. Su. Mo Xiaoyao said in a deep voice, staring at the middle-aged man in front of him with warning. Even after so long, he still couldn't accept someone mentioning Li's life or death in front of him. Moreover, this person was Li's blood-related uncle. Su Hongyu looked at him without any fear. He lightly snorted and said, Prince is so affectionate. This old man wants to thank Prince on behalf of Li Er. It's just. Li had used her pregnant body to set up this situation for Prince in the northwest. So the prince is hiding in Ruyang City to watch the show and watch the world fall into chaos and the people live in misery? Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes. After a while, a cold smile slowly appeared on his lips. He faintly said, so what? Don't they want the world? Then go fight for it. Didn't Mo Jingqi find the Ding King's residence an eyesore? Now that there's no Ding King's residence, isn't it perfect for him to do as he wishes? I will wait for him to bring millions of soldiers to quell the rebellion. From now on, the Dechu state will have another unparalleled monarch. The future monarchs will no longer have to worry about the Ding King's residence and the Maoist army. In this world, there are many people who want Ai's life. I will sit in Ruyang City and wait for them to come. Su Hongyu softly sighed. Looking at the man in front of him who had a murderous aura, he asked, Prince has nothing to live for. What crimes have the people committed? What crimes have those who have been loyal to the Ding King's residence for generations committed? Chapter 378. Ha! Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head and chuckled, Mr. Su, I'm afraid it's already too late for you to say this. Since this war has already started, it won't end easily until there's a winner and a loser. It's said that Mr. Hongyu is proficient in the art of heaven, can't you see, the world is in chaos, the people have no way of making a living. Su Hongyu said, so Prince is also proficient in the art of heaven? Mo Xiaoyao shook his head, his gaze clear. I don't understand the art of heaven, I just want this chaotic world, no one can change it. It wasn't that the world was formed because of the art of heaven, but because of the art of heaven. This chaotic world, this chess game, no one was destined to be able to escape. Then let them stay and be buried with Li Li and their child. Towards this kind of Mo Xiaoyao, even Su Hongyu didn't know how to persuade him. Looking at Mo Xiaoyao, his gaze gradually became warmer. At least, this man truly loved Li and Li Er's painstaking efforts towards him were not in vain. Looking at Mo Xiaoyao's calm expression that hid the endless pain in his eyes, Su Hongyu even felt that the words he wanted to say to persuade him were somewhat difficult to say. Reason will always be reason. Even someone like him who was called a great scholar, he never planned on living a life that was as proper as reason. This man needed the chaos of war and the lives of his enemies to quell the pain of losing his wife and unborn child. Just like when he heard the news about Li his first reaction was to kill that idiot Mo Jingqi, but not as if the subject had no choice but to die if the ruler wanted. But, whether it was for the Mahist army, for the Su family, for Li or for the people of the world, he couldn't really watch this man drag the world into a sea of blood, at least not for those innocent people and themselves. Looking at Mo Xiaoyao in front of him, Su Hongyu turned around and walked out. Just when Mo Xiaoyao thought that he had left, he returned. He placed the thick stack of files on the table beside Mo Xiaoyao. Zhuo Jing and the others behind him did the same. They carried a stack of files in their hands and placed them in front of Mo Xiaoyao before leaving silently. Ever since Yi Li went missing, Zhuo Jing, Wei Lin, and Lin Han, who had just returned, had been searching for her along the river day and night. In the end, the three of them began to appear and disappear mysteriously like ghosts. Both Mo Xiaoyao and Feng Zhiyao knew that they had not given up. They often went out to look for them. Su Hongyu lightly knocked on the dossier on the table and said, "These were all left behind by Li Er. You take a look yourself. Prince, tell me your decision after you've finished reading it. I'm afraid I'll have to nag Prince for a while." Mo Xiaoyao was stunned. He looked at the familiar and beautiful handwriting at the top of the file, on the future commercial feasibility plan of the Northwest. It was just like how Li would say some novel and seemingly reasonable words from time to time. Just by looking at this line, he could roughly understand what it was trying to say. There was also a small line of words at the bottom of the file. Li had a habit of leaving a date at the bottom of the file, Emperor Jing's 12th year, October 2nd, Mo Xiaoyao's eyes flashed. Li still spent time writing these things while guarding Hangzhou. Seeing that Mo Xiaoyao was lost in thought as he looked at the file, Su Hongyu waved at Zhuo Jing and the others and led them out. Only the occasional sound of the file being flipped could be heard in the empty room. Outside Mo Xiaoyao's temporary residence, Feng Zhiyao leaned against the wall and watched Su Hongyu walk out of the courtyard. His handsome eyes were filled with curiosity and vigilance. Right now, Prince's state made him feel slightly uneasy. But at the same time, Su Hongyu's arrival did not make him or the generals of the Mahist army happier. Of course, the world knew that the Su family was the smartest in the world. But the Su family had been as loyal to the Dechu state as the Ding King's mansion for many years. If Su Hongyu had come to persuade the prince on behalf of the emperor, with the prince's present state and the relationship between the Su family and the Wang Fei, the prince might be moved by Su Hongyu. And the generals of the Mahist army did not want to see such a situation. In these years, when the regent Mo Lufang was still alive, the imperial house had started to suppress the Mahist army. In these years, the treatment that the Mahist army and the prince had suffered made all the generals loyal to the Prince Ding mansion angry. Everyone was sad that the Wang Fei had died, but the series of orders that the prince had issued because of this caused the generals of the Mahist army to see a glimmer of hope. Su Hongyu stood outside the door and looked sideways at Feng Zhiyao, who was standing in the corner. He smiled faintly and said, "Is young Master Feng Sen waiting for me?" Looking at the unsurprised Su Hongyu, Feng Zhiyao's eyes flashed slightly. He raised an eyebrow and said with a smile, "Mr. Hongyu must have had a hard journey. Why don't you rest first before I ask Mister for advice? Su Hongyu laughed brightly and shook his head. This old man wants to drink a cup of tea. Would young Master Feng San do me the honor? Feng San smiled faintly and said with lowered eyes, then I will trouble Mr. Hongyu. The two moved to the guest house prepared for Su Hongyu. Su Hongyu personally brewed a pot of good tea and poured a cup for himself and Feng Zhiyao. Then he smiled faintly and said, this old man understands what young Master Feng San is worried about. Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows and looked at Su Hongyu without speaking. Su Hongyu smiled and shook his head. He looked at Feng Zhiyao's vigilant appearance as if he was looking at a disobedient junior. He smiled and said, the Su family, what they did 100 years ago, do you think that 100 years later, no one dares to do it again? Hearing this, Feng Zhiyao was shocked. He had no time to hide the astonishment on his face. He stared blankly at the elegant middle-aged man in front of him. He suddenly found that this great scholar who was supposed to be well-read and cultured had a sharp edge between his eyebrows. He suddenly remembered that 100 years ago, the Su family, the head of the Su family had personally killed the last emperor of the previous dynasty and opened the city gates to let Emperor Taizu enter the city. Although the head of the Su family had taken his own life and followed the last emperor of the previous dynasty, he had made the world deeply understand that the Su family was never simple literati who were blindly loyal, cowardly, or had strong character. They had decisiveness and ruthlessness that even military generals didn't have. Similarly, the head of the Su family had killed the emperor and opened the city not because he was loyal to the Dechu state, but because he wanted to save the people who had suffered through the chaos of war and for the Su family, which was about to be exterminated. As expected, the youngest son of the Su family, Su Yanli, ascended to the position of prime minister at the age of 19 and became a famous prime minister. And the Su family used the blood of the head of the Su family and more than 70 relatives in exchange for the respect of the world. Su Yanli's life and the prosperity of the Su family in the following 100 or 200 years. If no one deliberately mentioned it, in almost everyone's eyes, the Su family represented a scholarly family, overflowing with talent and strong character of literati. It wasn't until now that Feng Zhiyao clearly realized that the Su family also represented blood and killing, decisiveness, and unparalleled wisdom and strategy. A family that had prospered through 2 dynasties, especially during the change of dynasties, needed wisdom, decisiveness, and ruthlessness. It was definitely not something that could be achieved by an ordinary literati who had compassion for the world. The Su family didn't like blood, but it definitely didn't mean that they were afraid of it. Su Hongyu leisurely drank tea and looked at the young man's changing expression with a smile but didn't say anything. No family that had lasted for hundreds of years was truly merciful. Even if they seemed to be and had been working hard, it was definitely not the truth. The Su family saw it too clearly, which was why people found it hard to understand. Just like how they could fight to the death on the battlefield as literati for the sake of the country of the previous dynasty. Just like how they could retreat to Yunzhou under the suppression of the imperial family and no longer pay attention to the affairs of the court. Just like, they could personally cut off the head of the monarch and completely understand a struggling dynasty. Just like how they could sacrifice almost all of their clansmen for the continuation of their family. Chapter 379. Sir Su. Feng Zhiyao drank a mouthful of tea uncomfortably. He had always thought that he was smart enough, but sitting in front of this elegant scholar, he didn't know what he should say. Or rather, he didn't understand why Su Hongyu would say this in front of him. Su Hongyu looked at him and laughed softly. I just hope that this old man's words can calm the hearts of everyone in the Mahist army. The Su family is not enemies with the Ding kingdom. Feng Zhiyao suddenly raised his head. He wasn't sure if what Su Hongyu said was what he understood. He only heard Su Hongyu continue, but, young Master Feng San, is this really the best preparation? Was this the best preparation? Feng Zhiyao was at a loss. What preparation? The world was in chaos, and the world was fighting for supremacy. Feng Zhiyao's heart was slightly startled. Very quickly, his heart began to beat wildly. Because of Su Hongyu's words, it seemed that something had suddenly pierced through a layer of blurry curtain in his heart. The world was fighting for supremacy, countless Mahist army were looking forward to the direction that the prince would lead them in. Only those who understood the Mahist army knew that the Mahist army was once the most promising army to unify the world. However, because they were feared by the successive emperors, they were restricted in all aspects. That was why the Dechu state's ambition to unify the world was never realized. Not only that, the Mahist army's ambition seemed to gradually extinguish. And now, were they really prepared to fight for supremacy? The prince, who had just lost his princess, had indeed caused the world to be in chaos with a snap of his fingers. However, that was mostly because he wanted to stir up the world and take revenge on those people that the prince hated and hated. He also wanted to be a bystander. And the prince didn't seem to have the mind to consider the future of the Mahist army. Even if they relied on the Mahist army's bravery to obtain a temporary victory in the beginning, this kind of situation couldn't be maintained for long. Also, the prince's health was an unstable factor that threatened the Mahist army at all times. The original excitement, unwillingness, and enmity towards Su Hongyu instantly disappeared without a trace. Feng Zhiyao couldn't help but sweat in his heart. He respectfully looked at Su Hongyu and said, "Sir, please advise. Since Sir Su traveled thousands of miles to Ruyang, you definitely wouldn't watch the prince be like this." Feng Zhiyao didn't finish his words, but Su Hongyu clearly understood what he wanted to express. He just smiled faintly, the prince just couldn't understand it now. Feng Zhiyao smiled bitterly, "Prince has been like this for several months. It's all Feng San's fault for being muddle-headed for a moment and not thinking. Many thanks for Sir Su's guidance." Su Hongyu smiled faintly, looking up at the first star rising in the gradually darkening sky. His gaze was distant. The Mahist army has its own selfish motives. The Su family also has its own selfish motives, the Su family also has its own selfish motives. That one in Chujing. Su Hongyu shook his head, not saying more. The Su family had never been blindly loyal. Not only for the people of the world and Li Er, but also for the continuation of the Su family's 100 years of inheritance. The Su family wouldn't support Mo Jingqi. Mo Xiuyao stayed alone in the room for 2 days, not seeing anyone. On the third day, he invited Su Hongyu in for a secret discussion. Other than the two people involved, no one knew what they talked about. 3 days later, Su Hongyu secretly set off to return to Yunzhou. On the second day after Su Hongyu left, Mo Xiuyao walked out of the room again. Seeing the man slowly walk out of the room, Feng Zhiyao inwardly sighed in relief. The Mo Xiuyao in front of him was still haggard and pale, even paler than before. His eyes were still cold and ruthless, but there was no longer that frightening danger. Feng Zhiyao knew that the prince had finally truly calmed down. After calming down, Mo Xiuyao picked up the tasks he had thrown to his subordinates in the past few months. He methodically ordered the various government orders and the deployment of troops. In the world of war, the originally lifeless northwest region gradually regained its vitality. Subordinate Qin Feng greets Prince. Qin Feng stood in front of Mo Xiuyao, a faint scar appearing on his young face. His entire temperament had also undergone an earth-shattering change from a few months ago. If in the past Qin Feng was a sword hidden in its scabbard, now he was a sharp blade waiting to strike at any time. In the past few months, Qin Feng and his Qi Lin had left traces in every place on the northwest border. At the beginning, they had intercepted the 300,000 troops of Xiling according to the Queen's orders and burned the Xiling provisions. After the news that the Queen had fallen off the cliff, Qin Feng and Qi Lin started to fight independently and madly retaliated against the Xiling troops on the border. In the short span of 3 months, the Xiling troops had changed commanders 3 times, and the barracks had been set on fire twice. Even the Emperor of Shiling's imperial palace and Jinan Palace thousands of miles away were not spared. While there were no major losses, the Emperor of Shiling and Jinan Palace were in disarray. At the same time, the high intensity and various battles had transformed all the Qi Lin into real battle-hardened elite soldiers. Now at the border of Shiling, the name Qi Lin was even more powerful than the Mahist army and the Black Cloud cavalry. Mo Xiuyao sized up Qin Feng for a moment and said, "I know about your performance these days. Are there any injuries?" Qin Feng was silent for a moment and said, "Thank you for your concern, Prince. 3 of my brothers died in battle, and 5 were seriously injured." Mo Xiuyao asked, "Do you know why I summoned you back?" "I don't know." Qin Feng's tone was a bit stiff. They had planned to all go to the Emperor of Shiling City to avenge the Queen, but the prince had sent someone to order him to leave immediately and go back on his word at Ruyang. Not only was he unwilling to do so, but all of his brothers were unwilling as well. Almost all of them had been taught by the Queen. If they could not avenge the Queen's death at the hands of Genin of Gojoseon, how could they face the Queen? Mo Xiuyao took a file and put it on the table. He said, "Lei Jinting is not so easy to kill. Even if you want to kill him, how many lives do you plan to sacrifice?" Qin Feng said loudly, "Even if everyone in Qi Lin dies in battle, we will avenge the Queen." Mo Xiuyao pointed at the file in his hand and said, "Take it back and read it. Come see I when you understand." Qin Feng reached out and took it. He lowered his head and looked at the familiar handwriting on the file. Even if he was an iron-blooded man, his eyes couldn't help but heat up. He raised his head and said, "Reporting to Wang Ye, Wang Fei showed this to me. I originally planned to wait until the war in the northwest subsided before executing." Mo Xiuyao looked at him. "Then, can you do it?" Qin Feng was silent for a moment. Then he nodded and said, "Yes. This subordinate will not disappoint Wang Yi and Wang Fei's expectations." Mo Xiuyao nodded. "Very good. I will leave all of this to you. I will only give you 1 year. I want Qi Lin's name to be known all over the world." "Yes, my lord." Mo Xiuyao waved his hand and said, "Go. If you need anything, go find Feng San and Zhuo Jing." "Yes, my lord. I will take my leave." "Oh, right." Before Qin Feng could leave, he heard Mo Xiuyao's voice behind him. "Go find Mo Hua. He has someone for you. Mo Hua knows what to do." Qin Feng nodded silently. After returning, he had already met Zhuo Jing and Lin Han. Naturally, he knew who Mo Xiuyao was referring to. A cold light flashed in his eyes. He did not know whether he was happy that the woman was still alive or despised Mo Hua for not being able to kill a woman. Chapter 380. Young Master Han. As soon as he stepped out of the door, he saw Han Mingyue walking quickly towards him. Qin Feng frowned and nodded in greeting. Because of Yili, almost everyone around Yili didn't like Han Mingyue. Even when Yili was still around, their relationship with Han Mingyue was still considered peaceful. Han Mingyue looked at Qin Feng, who had changed a lot, and a trace of worry flashed through her eyes. She nodded and asked, "Is the prince here?" Qin Feng nodded and said, "This one still has matters to attend to, so I'll take my leave first." Seeing the back of his figure leave without stopping, Han Mingyue was startled and couldn't help but smile bitterly. In the past few months, he hadn't been very well received in Ruyang City. Although Mo Xiuyao didn't chase him away, the people below him clearly didn't welcome him. If it wasn't for Han Mingxi's face, Zhuo Jing and the others would have already thrown him out. Han Mingyue had never thought that there would be a day when he would have to rely on the face of the little brother he had raised since he was young. But, he couldn't leave this place. He didn't know what Mo Xiuyao was thinking. He clearly hated Drunken Butterfly to the core, but he still didn't kill her. Han Mingyue could even tell that although Mo Xiaoyao had ordered people to torture Drunken Butterfly, he didn't order them to kill her. He even allowed him to visit Drunken Butterfly every few days. It was because of this that he couldn't harden his heart and leave. Sometimes he even wondered if it would have been better if Mo Xiaoyao had directly ordered people to kill Drunken Butterfly. Xiaoyao. Stepping into the study, he saw Mo Xiaoyao sitting behind the desk, lost in thought. Coming back to his senses, Mo Xiaoyao looked at him with a calm expression. What is it? What exactly are you planning to do with Drunk Butterfly? Han Mingyue could not help but ask. He had already heard from Mo Hua that Drunk Butterfly would be handed over to Qin Feng today. He did not know what Qin Feng could do, but his instincts told him that Drunk Butterfly's situation would be even worse. Mo Xiaoyao smiled, looked up at him and asked, Does Su Zuodi think that I still have feelings for her? Han Mingyue remained silent. Drunken Butterfly had not suffered much in the past few months, at least compared to Mo Xiaoyao's ruthless attitude back at the cliff. It was a far cry. Mo Xiaoyao even sent people to treat her hand. Therefore, Su Zuodi also believed that Mo Xiaoyao really couldn't bear to part with her. The reason why he still locked her up and made her suffer was because he was still angry and wanted to put on a show for others to see. But Han Mingyue knew that all of this was just Su Zuodi's wishful thinking. Since the moment Su Zuodi turned and left many years ago, she had forever lost the ability to affect Mo Xiaoyao, or rather, she had never had the ability to do so. And now, when Su Zuodi was mentioned, the viciousness in Mo Xiaoyao's eyes was even more shocking. Don't worry, she won't die. At least, she won't die before October this year. Han Mingyue was shocked. You plan to? Mo Xiaoyao said calmly, that's exactly what you're thinking. If there is no news of Li Li before October this year, I plan to use her blood as a sacrifice to the mountain, on the mountain where Li fell off the cliff. Next year, it will be Lei Zhenting's turn. What do you think of this idea? Every year, there will be one person, all those who hurt Li Li and her child, until Li returns. Or until the world is completely dyed red. But, Han Mingyue said with difficulty, Princess Ding is already dead. In the study, looking at Mo Xiaoyao's calm and unperturbed eyes, Han Mingyue felt that there were countless things she wanted to say, but she couldn't spit them out. Mo Xiaoyao never planned to let Su Zuodi go, he already knew. If he was in Mo Xiaoyao's position, he would have already torn Su Zuodi to pieces, but he wasn't Mo Xiaoyao after all. The woman he fell in love with wasn't called Yi Li, so he was destined to be unable to watch Su Zuodi suffer. However, he no longer had any bargaining chips to make Mo Xiaoyao change his mind. He even suspected that there was nothing that could make Mo Xiaoyao change his mind, unless Yi Li came back from the dead. Mo Xiaoyao no longer paid any attention to Han Mingyue, who was standing on the side thinking about something. The reason why he hadn't expelled Han Mingyue for so long and allowed him to stay in Ruyang City and even live in the residence was only because Han Mingyue had helped Li Li at the edge of the cliff, but this didn't mean that he would make any concessions to him because of this. He lowered his head to look at the various files on the table. The beautiful handwriting on them added a trace of gentleness to his eyes. The contents of the files were enough to amaze the world. Even he himself had never known that his wife had so many wonderful ideas, so many grand ideas. Ever since she knew that Mo Jingqi and Nan Zhao had secretly reached an agreement in Xiling, Li had already clearly seen that the day when the Mahist army and the imperial court would break off relations was coming. So she did everything she could to guard the entire Northwest, and during this time she painstakingly thought about the survival and development of the hundreds of thousands of Mahist army in the relatively barren Northwest. If Li Li wasn't a woman, Mo Xiaoyao believed that she definitely had the qualifications to become a famous minister of a generation that would be more famous than her ancestors. But now, he was gently stroking the files in his hands. Mo Xiaoyao's eyes were filled with tenderness and love. Li Li, I definitely won't let your painstaking efforts go to waste. Chapter 381. Yi Li smiled and stroked her protruding belly. Thank you for your kind words, sister-in-law Lin. My surname is Chu. You can call me Junwei. Mrs. Lin looked at Yi Li and saw that she only mentioned her surname. She thought that a 16 or 17-year-old girl was rescued in a place like this while pregnant. There must be something that was hard to say. Her simple face showed some relief and sympathy. She patted Yi Li's hand and said, everything will be fine. Don't think too much. Take good care of your body. Your child is more important. Yi Li nodded and took the porridge that Mrs. Lin handed over. She slowly put it into her mouth. Although she had been unconscious for a few months and felt weak all over, even the hand holding the spoon was slightly trembling. With her extraordinary endurance, she didn't appear to be in too much of a sorry state. Mrs. Lin watched her eat the porridge while sitting next to her and chatting with her. It turned out that this Mrs. Lin in front of her was not the person who saved her. The person who saved her was the only old doctor in the village. It was just that the old doctor didn't have any relatives at home. It wasn't convenient for him to take care of a woman, so he asked Mrs. Lin to help take care of her. Speaking of this, Yi Li hurriedly wanted to greet the old doctor who saved her. Mrs. Lin hurriedly stopped her and said, Uncle Lin went up the mountain to pick herbs. He won't be back until later. Mrs. Lin knows that you look like a well-educated girl, but there aren't so many rules in this place. You should take good care of yourself and don't waste Uncle Lin's painstaking efforts. Yi Li nodded and thanked Mrs. Lin. Then she changed the topic and said something else. When Mrs. Lin put away the things and left, Yi Li had a general understanding of this place. Although she didn't know the specific location, it should be an isolated village not far from the place where she fell off the cliff. She was found by a small river when Dr. Lin went into the mountain to pick herbs. But it was strange that after so long, the Mahist army and shadow guards still hadn't found her. In the evening, Yi Li sat outside the house by the herb garden and looked at the sunset in a daze. The village wasn't big. There were only a dozen or so families in total. The small village was built on the side of the mountain. There were no rules, and they were scattered at the foot of the mountain. Every house looked very old and small. Obviously, the people here did not advocate luxury and enjoyment. Occasionally, young men, young women, and women would pass by the house and smile kindly at her as she sat by the herb garden. This is a quiet and simple village, Yi Li thought silently as she looked at the setting sun on the horizon. Under the setting sun, a white-haired old man strolled over with a medicine basket on his back. When he saw Yi Li sitting at the edge of the medicine garden, he raised his white eyebrows and said, You're awake? It seems like you're really lucky. This old man thought that you would need at least a month to wake up. Yi Li stood up and respectfully bowed to the old man. She said, Junwei thanks Dr. Lin for saving my life. The old man looked at her with interest. Young lady of a noble family. It was rare to see a young lady with such a good life. Girl, what is your surname? Although lying to her savior was not very good, Yi Li did not want to take the risk. She said in a low voice, Chu Junwei. The old man looked at her. After a while, he stroked his beard and nodded. Chu Junwei, a good name. It suits a girl like you. However, this old man remembers that there is no noble family with the surname Chu in the Chu state. Looking at you, girl, you don't seem like someone raised by an ordinary family. Yi Li smiled apologetically. She said, Dr. Lin is too kind. Junwei, her family was born in Yunzhou. Speaking of which, she is related to Yunzhou's Su family. As she spoke, Yi Li calmly observed the old man's expression. She saw the old man knit his brows and nod. He said, Yunzhou's Su family. That makes sense. Forget it. This old man doesn't care which family you are from. Since this old man saved you, it can be considered fate. Rest at ease and recuperate. Yi Li lowered her eyes and said in a low voice, "Thank you, Dr. Lin." Looking at the old man's expression, it did not seem like he was acting. The news of her falling off the cliff could not be hidden. It must have spread throughout the Dechu state by now. She had deliberately mentioned Yunzhou's Su family. As long as someone had some understanding of the family, they would at least make some connections. However, the old man's expression did not change in the slightest. Unless he was so good at acting that there were no flaws, or he did not know that Princess Ding had fallen off the cliff. Yi Li concluded that it was the latter. When she fell off the cliff, she had thrown her last dagger at Genom of Gojoseon. Even her clothes were the most ordinary and unremarkable. There was nothing on her body that could prove her identity. Unless it was someone who knew her, it would be impossible for them to recognize her from the very beginning. Although she felt somewhat apologetic for lying to the old man, Yi Li knew that she had to be careful. She could not allow herself to fall into the enemy's hands and become a bargaining chip to threaten Mo Xiuyao. Thinking of Mo Xiuyao, Yi Li felt like her heart was being tugged at. There was a slight pain in her heart. It seemed that they had spent the entire last year in constant parting. Knowing the news of her death, thinking of Mo Xiuyao's body, Yi Li's frown deepened. "Why aren't you coming in? Do you want to stay out in the rain? Can't you see that it's about to rain?" The old man's impolite voice came from inside the room. Yi Li raised her head. Sure enough, the setting sun was covered by dark clouds. It looked like it was about to rain. Yi Li smiled faintly and turned to enter the room. During dinner, Yi Li volunteered to make 2 simple dishes. Dr. Lin seemed to be very satisfied. He looked at Yi Li and said, "At least I didn't pick up a useless piece of trash." Yi Li couldn't help but have black lines appear on her face. Dr. Lin had already sat down at the simple table and started eating. While eating, Dr. Lin seemed to remember to ask about Yi Li. "Where are you from?" Yi Li thought for a moment, but still answered honestly, "Hangzhou." Dr. Lin frowned and asked, "Hangzhou? Where is that?" Yi Li was surprised. She didn't expect him to ask such a question. Hangzhou was the #1 city in the northwest. Being born near the northwest, even if he hadn't heard of the Su family, he should know where Hangzhou was. Dr. Lin frowned and said, "I haven't been out for too long. The names of many places have probably changed." Yi Li's heart skipped a beat. Hangzhou's original name really wasn't Hangzhou. At least 50 years ago, Hangzhou was attached to Ruyang and was called Biyang. More than 50 years ago, Hangzhou was officially included in the northwest. It was only when it became a province of its own that it changed its name to Hangzhou. After thinking for a moment, Yi Li said, "There's another name. It seems to be called Biyang." Biyang? Dr. Lin's chopsticks paused for a moment. He asked in confusion, "How did a girl like you come here from Biyang?" Yi Li looked at him in confusion. Dr. Lin said, "Although I haven't left here for a long time, I still know that with your speed, it would take you at least 2 months to come here from Biyang." 2 months? Where is this place? Yi Li didn't believe it. According to Aunt Lin, they picked her up on the morning of the 3rd day after she fell off the cliff. How could she run so far? Even if she floated with the river, it wouldn't be that fast. Thinking of this, Yi Li paused. She wasn't too familiar with the river she fell from, but she wasn't completely unfamiliar with it either. According to history, if she fell into the water and was directly washed downstream, then she would at most be washed to a lake more than 100 li away from Hangzhou. She wouldn't have mysteriously appeared by a small river in the mountains. Lowering her head and recalling the mountains and rivers around Hangzhou in her memory, Yi Li asked with uncertainty, "This place is in the mountains to the north of Hangzhou?" Dr. Lin gave her a look of praise and said, "This place is at least 700 to 800 li away from Hangzhou. Most importantly, it's all rugged mountain roads. Not to mention the wild beasts, poisonous snakes, and insects along the way." Chapter 382. Hearing this, Yili was completely helpless. She frowned and said, "Then how do I go back?" Dr. Lin rolled his eyes and said, "How would I know? This old man saved you. Do you think I have to be responsible for sending you home? First, after you give birth to the child, take care of your body, and see if anyone is willing to send you back. But I don't think so. Second, settle down in the village and live a good life after you marry someone. Forget about the past. Don't worry, the young men in this village are all pretty good. They won't dislike you because you've been married before. Do you want this old man to act as a matchmaker for you?" Yili directly rolled her eyes at him. Although they had only known each other for less than a day, she could tell that this old man was a strange old man who didn't act like an old man. She calculated in her heart. It would take at least 4 more months for her to give birth to the child. In addition, after the child was born, she still needed to take care of it for a period of time before she could leave. In other words, she would need at least 6 months before she could leave. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but frown. But at this time, there was nothing she could do. She could only hope that Hung Zhou and Mo Xiaoyao were safe and sound. At the very least, she still wanted the baby to be alive, right? Yili lowered her head and gently stroked the baby who would occasionally move. She faintly smiled. "Humph. Are you thinking about that heartless lover of yours?" Dr. Lin snorted and squinted his eyes at her gentle and smiling expression. Yili helplessly smiled and said, "He's the father of my child, my husband. And he's very good to me." "If he's very good, will you appear here?" Dr. Lin snorted disdainfully. At a glance, he could tell that this girl came from a scholarly and wealthy family. If she was very good, she should have been raised in a boudoir and lived a life of luxury. Which noble family's daughter would wander to this place? At the very least, this was the first time this old man had seen someone like this in his 60 years of life. Yili faintly smiled and didn't refute his words. "Xiaoyao. I'll take the baby back very soon." Staying in this isolated and quiet village, Yili's health improved day by day under Dr. Lin's care. Yili was surprised that such a skilled doctor like Dr. Lin could be found in such an isolated mountain village. Including a famous doctor like Shenyang, Yili had seen many skilled doctors. But even so, this unknown Dr. Lin's medical skills could be said to be one of the best. Yili had seen with her own eyes how he helped a young man from the village who had broken his leg while hunting in the mountains. Originally, Yili thought that the young man would at least be crippled, but after a month, he was able to walk on his own. Although there were still some inconveniences, she could see that the young man would be able to walk as if he was flying after resting for 2 or 3 months. Sensing Yili's surprised gaze, Dr. Lin looked at her proudly and said, "How can an ordinary person like you understand my medical skills?" The corner of Yili's mouth twitched. She lowered her head and saw that she was immersed in a large number of medical books that Dr. Lin had thrown over. Now, the child was already more than 7 months old. After nursing her for more than a month, Dr. Lin looked at her from the corner of his eyes as usual. He stared at her bulging abdomen and snorted, "This boy is very lucky. In the future, he will be a headache." Hearing this, Yili gently stroked her abdomen and smiled. He accompanied her to fall from the cliff and lie down for 4 months. Wasn't he very lucky? While reading the medical books, she watched Dr. Lin busily arrange the herbs he had brought back from the mountains outside the house. Yili asked curiously, "Dr. Lin, you are different from the people in this village." Dr. Lin's hands paused for a moment before he quickly resumed his work. He didn't even raise his head as he said, "Are you the same as them?" Yili smiled and said, "Then, Dr. Lin, are you admitting that you came from outside like me?" Dr. Lin was different from the people in this village. Yili had noticed it when he woke up 2 days ago. The people in this small village respected this old doctor. It was not only because of his excellent medical skills, but also because of his profound knowledge that was different from the people in this village. No matter what era it was, the common people would always have extra respect for scholars. Dr. Lin's home also had a special study room. It was neatly filled with all kinds of books. Yili casually picked up 2 books and found that one of them was an ancient book that had been lost in the previous dynasty. It was very strange for such a person to appear in this small village where almost no one was literate. Moreover, it was said that he had lived here for decades. Dr. Lin stood up and patted his hands. He looked at Yili and said, "This old man can also see that you are not an ordinary girl from a noble family. These days, you must have inquired about me in the village, right?" Yili pursed her lips and smiled faintly. She did not deny it. These days, she had indeed inquired about Dr. Lin. However, there was nothing special. Dr. Lin had moved to this village 30 years ago. It was said that his surname was Lin. However, because most of the people in this village had the surname Lin, Yili felt that this rumor might not be true. It was said that at that time, he had an infant named Lin Yuan who was still in swaddling clothes. However, 11 or 12 years ago, Lin Yuan left the village and never came back. Dr. Lin didn't look for him either. After so many years, many people gradually forgot that there was such a person in the world. "Dr. Lin, have you not planned to leave this place?" Yili asked. Dr. Lin's eyes were somewhat dim. After a while, he said, "This old man is already so old. Where else can I go? It would be better for me to stay here and treat the villagers. In the future, when I die, they can bury me or something." Feeling the sadness in the old man's eyes, Yili thought for a moment. "Dr. Lin, have you not thought of looking for your son? Perhaps I can be of some help." Dr. Lin snorted coldly. "He won't come back. Moreover, he is not my son." Yili raised her eyebrows. She decided to end the conversation here. Dr. Lin was clearly not a person who liked to cultivate. His temper was not very good. After confirming that Dr. Lin said that she would not be able to leave this remote village for the time being, Yili felt at ease and decided to stay here. 10 days after she woke up, a small wooden house was built next to Dr. Lin's house. Then, she moved in. Usually, Yili would walk around the village and chat with the villagers. Sometimes, she would help Dr. Lin with some trivial chores. After meals, she would put a room full of books in Dr. Lin's house. Gradually, Yili's room was filled with books. Regarding the matter of Yili taking away his ancient books, Dr. Lin did not express anything. No one in this village could read or write. Ever since the child he raised left this place 11 years ago, those books were just left there, and no one would look at them again. For the rest of the time, Yili used a simple hairpin that she always carried with her to exchange for some soft cloth with a girl in the village who knew how to weave cloth. In a few months, the child would be born. She had to prepare clothes for the child. Looking at the simple and somewhat rough cloth in her hand, Yili felt a slight bitterness in her heart. If it wasn't here, the child would definitely eat and use the best things when he was born. But now, looking up at the setting sun outside the house, Yili sighed softly. The outside world was probably in a state of war. At least it was much safer here, wasn't it? Chapter 383. While sewing clothes for the baby, Yili also sewed a set of clothes for Dr. Lin. Although the old man didn't show anything on his face, he didn't mock Yili as much as before. From time to time, he would throw 1 or 2 books that Yili had only heard of but had long been lost. Yili looked at the ancient books that Dr. Lin threw to her as if they were worthless trash, and her lips curved into a faint smile. She knew that this eccentric old man was gradually accepting her existence. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that there were so many people outside that she was worried about, living in this small village for the rest of her life would also be a good choice. "Sister Chu. Sister Chu, are you there?" Just as she was thinking, a young man's voice came from outside the house. Yili sighed helplessly. No matter where in this world, there would always be one or two people who would make people speechless. She supported herself on the table and stood up. The person outside the house had already walked in. It was a tall young man with a pheasant in his hand. When he saw Yili, he quickly went up to her and said with a smile, "Sister Chu, I went up the mountain to hunt a pheasant. Let me give it to you to nourish your body." Yili sighed helplessly in her heart. She raised her head and smiled at the young man. "Brother Lin, thank you for your kindness. But I don't eat much meat, so you should take it back and give it to uncle and aunt to nourish their bodies." The young man frowned and disagreed. "How can that be? Even if you don't eat, the child still needs nourishment." My mother asked me to give it to you." Speaking up to hear, the young man's simple face had a touch of red and he looked at her eagerly. Looking at the young man in front of her, Yili couldn't help but want to touch her forehead. In fact, there were also disadvantages in being too simple and honest, right? If it was in other places, a woman like her who lived alone and was pregnant would be a taboo. But in this small village, ever since she could walk around outside, Dr. Lin told her that there were already two families who came to her door and hinted that they wanted to marry her. They also didn't care that she was pregnant. Although she had already explained several times that she came here because of an accident, and that she would leave after the child was born and recovered. However, it was obvious that not many people believed her. After all, in their eyes, it was dangerous to leave this place. Even a strong man would not dare to go out easily, let alone a weak woman with a child like her. "Big brother Lin, thank you for your kindness. But, my husband and I love each other. He must be waiting for me at home. So, as long as the child is born, no matter what, I must bring the child back to see him." "So, Big brother Lin, you really don't have to worry so much about me." Originally, Yili really didn't want to be so straightforward. However, this person would send some wild game food to her house every 2 to 3 days. In the end, every time she went out, the villagers would drag her to talk about these things with an ambiguous expression. It really annoyed Yili. Most importantly, there were some things that needed to be resolved decisively. Procrastinating was not a good thing. The young man's face turned even redder. He was a little depressed and a little flustered as he said, "I know. Dr. Lin said that you are a young miss from a rich family. I don't deserve you. Then, I got this on the mountain. You can keep it." In the end, it seemed that he didn't know what to say. The young man threw down the pheasant and hurriedly threw it out. Yili looked at the door. She lowered her head and held her round belly with a wry smile. "You little girl, that kid is the best young man in our village." At some point in time, Dr. Lin had walked in from outside. He looked at the wild game on the table and said with understanding. Yili helplessly smiled bitterly and said, "Dr. Lin, why are you teasing me like this? It's not like you don't know that I must leave here." Dr. Lin sat down and sighed, "I know. I can tell at first glance that you are not an ordinary person. This small mountain village can't hold you. You are just like that kid in the past. He didn't have the slightest bit of heart. After so many years, he still didn't come back to visit." Seeing the old man frown and complain, Yili faintly smiled. In her heart, she thought that if she had the chance in the future, she would help the old man find this Lin Yuan. Dr. Lin looked at her with some regret and said, "This old man is not young anymore. Originally, I saw that you were smart and had good perception, so I wanted to pass on my medical skills to someone. This village, in the future, there will be a doctor to look after it. Dr. Lin, why don't you pick someone in this village to inherit your skills?" Yili asked curiously. Dr. Lin had lived in this village for 30 years. It was reasonable to say that if he wanted to find someone to inherit his skills, he should have found someone long ago. Dr. Lin lightly snorted and said, "There is no one in this village who is literate. It is said that their ancestors set a rule that they are not allowed to read and they are not allowed to leave the village. If they are illiterate, what can I teach them? At most, they will be a third-rate doctor. Yili smiled and said, it is quite a pity. If Dr. Lin doesn't mind, then teach Junwei. But I don't know how much he will be able to learn in these few months. Dr. Lin looked her up and down. When he got up to leave, he said, first, memorize the book I gave you yesterday. Looking at the old man's back, Yili faintly smiled and said, yes, master. At the beginning of April, King Li and Nanzhao, who were fighting with the Dechu state in the south, withdrew their troops. The originally fierce battle showed signs of easing. Once King Li and Nanzhao stopped fighting, the south of the Dechu state would only have Shilin Leitingfeng's hundreds of thousands of troops and horses. No matter how strong Shiling's troops were, they were still far from the mainland. The Dechu state was vast and rich in resources. In the middle, there were hundreds of thousands of Mahist army eyeing them covetously. Leitingfeng also gradually stopped advancing. Although the north and the northern tribes had some friction, they had both won and lost. No one had gained any advantage, so they were in a deadlock. Regarding this, whether it was Feng Zhiyao or the other people in Ruyang City, they were all deeply worried. Once the Dechu state stopped fighting with the other countries, it was entirely possible that they would come to an agreement and unite the various powers to deal with them. In response, Mo Xiuyao only smiled and said nothing. Prince, Mo Jingqi must have already reached an agreement with Mo Jingli. Once Shilin and the northern tribes also stop fighting, Mo Jingqi may very well turn around to deal with us. In the study, Feng Zhiyao said worriedly. Mo Xiuyao smiled faintly and said, Feng San, the Mahist army has always been a great threat to the nobles of the other countries. Even now, it is still the same. So, even if they all join forces to deal with I will not find it strange. Feng Zhiyao frowned and said, does Prince already have a countermeasure? Mo Xiuyao gently stroked the scroll in his hand and said with lowered eyes, countermeasure. Feng San, what the Mahist army needs right now is not a countermeasure, but a victory. Feng Zhiyao looked at the overbearing king in front of him and said doubtfully, a victory? With a cold smile, Mo Xiuyao nodded and said, that's right, after so many years, the Mahist army's invincible reputation has long been covered in dust. I want Mo Jingqi to make the first move. Let's use him as a practice. Let the world know that the Mahist army is still the same Mahist army. Feng Zhiyao was a bit doubtful. He rubbed his forehead and said, if the four countries attack us at the same time, Prince, no matter how brave the Mahist army is, they will not be able to withstand an endless stream of enemies. Mo Xiuyao narrowed his eyes and looked at Feng Zhiyao. After a while, he let out a low laugh. Seeing Feng Zhiyao's doubtful expression, Mo Xiuyao laughed and said, Feng San, you call yourself smart, but you are a complete mess when it comes to politics. Do you think there will be a time when the four countries attack us at the same time? Feng Zhiyao furrowed his brows in deep thought. Mo Xiuyao carelessly rubbed his fingertips and said lightly, in this world, there are no eternal enemies, and no eternal friends. The only thing that is truly eternal is each person's own benefit. If the Mahist army is gone, who will benefit the most? The Mahist army today still has more than 500,000 people. If they want to truly destroy will 500,000 be enough? Who will put in more effort and who will put in less effort? And themselves, there are the tribal disputes in Nanzhao, the small countries in Shilin are in turmoil, and the northern tribes are suffering from drought and lack of harvest. There is also the Dechu state. Mo Jingqi and Mo Jingli, do you think they will sincerely ally together? Chapter 384. Hearing Mo Xiuyao's words, Feng Zhiyao felt his heart suddenly become clear. He smiled with some shame and said, I'm thinking too much. Prince probably already has an idea. Then, the Mahist army will be on high alert and wait for the enemy to come. However, this subordinate thinks that it's best not to face Mo Jingqi's people from the start. Mo Xiuyao looked at him with raised eyebrows. Feng Zhiyao said, Mo Jingqi is wantonly slandering Prince. If we face Mo Jingqi from the start, I'm afraid that Prince will be accused of plotting a rebellion. Mo Xiuyao gave a light snort and clearly didn't care. He only asked, what is the reaction of the Mahist army soldiers? The Mahist army has been suppressed by Mo Jingqi all these years. They are very clear about this matter. Naturally, they will follow Prince's orders. Feng Zhiyao felt a bit helpless. He really didn't understand why Prince didn't even consider refuting the dirty water that Mo Jingqi had poured on him. Even he was clear about the importance of the people's hearts, but Prince didn't seem to care about this problem at all. As if he saw through Feng Zhiyao's thoughts, Mo Xiuyao said lightly, no matter how you argue, the Mahist army is gradually leaving Dechu state. No matter how much you say, in the eyes of many people, you're just trying to cover it up. Mo Jingqi likes to play, so I will play with him. He has been spoiled by the late emperor and empress dowager. The world of those who win the hearts of the people, does he think it's that easy to win the hearts of the people? Don't worry about Mo Jingqi. Send a message to Han Mingxi and ask him to come back to CI. Also, tell Leng Haoyu to come back as soon as possible. I have something to tell them. Feng Zhiyao nodded in agreement. When Leng Haoyu was mentioned, Feng Zhiyao hesitated for a moment before asking, Prince, do you think General Murong should? Murong Shen was also considered a famous general of Dechu state, and had once followed Mo Lufang. Now, Murong Shen's only daughter was the wife of Leng Haoyu, one of Mo Xiuyao's most trusted men. So it was natural to draw Murong Shen to his side. Mo Xiuyao pondered for a moment, then waved his hand and said, not for now. General Murong is definitely Mo Jingqi's first suspect, and he is definitely surrounded by spies. As long as Mo Jingqi doesn't do anything to General Murong, there's no need to alert him for the time being. The South also needs a reliable general to guard it. Although I don't like Mo Jingqi, I don't want those southern barbarians to set foot inside the Great Pass. Hearing Mo Xiuyao's words, Feng Zhiyao knew what to do. Mo Xiuyao obviously had confidence in Murong Shen, but now he still needed Murong Shen to stay in the south. Tilting his head and thinking, Feng Zhiyao also understood Mo Xiuyao's idea. If talking about the surrounding countries, which one did Feng Zhiyao hate the most, he would definitely choose Nanzhao. Different from the valiant Xiling and northern tribes, the Nanzhao tribes had different fierce customs, but they were definitely the most xenophobic of all the countries. And those messy and dazzling poisonous insects and ants, Feng Zhiyao really didn't want to imagine what would happen if they turned the beautiful and rich central plains into a place full of poisonous insects and snakes. I understand. I'll do it immediately. Mo Xiuyao nodded and asked Feng Zhiyao to leave. Feng Zhiyao cupped his hands and left. Looking at Mo Xiuyao, who was sitting behind the desk and lost in thought, he moved his lips and wanted to say something. But in the end, he swallowed his words and quietly left the study. Yili walked back with a basket of wild vegetables in the sunset. Her beautiful face was a healthy red in the sun, and small beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. Although she was already well, it was still a bit difficult for her to go up the mountain while being more than 7 months pregnant. Taking advantage of the good weather today, she went to the small river where Dr. Lin found her. The winding but rapidly flowing river was obviously not the same as the one she fell from. It was not even a branch of the river. At the end of the river was a waterfall falling from a high place, but Yili knew that she definitely didn't fall from the waterfall. That waterfall was at least 20 meters high, and there was also the shallow river below. Even if the gravity of the fall didn't kill her, it would definitely be enough to kill her. So, it was very likely that there was an underground river below the waterfall, and she might have been washed out from there. Unfortunately. Looking at the rapidness of the water, even if her guess was correct, it was not a suitable way to go back. Furthermore, she was pregnant, so it was even more impossible. Helplessly giving up on the idea of going in to investigate, Yili gathered some wild vegetables and fruits that she could use before strolling back to the small village she had lived in for several months. Dr. Lin and Yili's hut was at the outermost edge of the small village. At this time, it was already time for smoke to rise from the chimneys of the houses. In the small village, there was not a single person to be seen. From afar, Yili saw that there was no smoke coming from Dr. Lin's hut. She raised her eyebrows in confusion. Master hasn't returned yet? Didn't he say that he wouldn't go out today? Slowly walking into two small wooden huts not far from each other, Yili's beautiful eyebrows gradually furrowed. There were people in Dr. Lin's hut, and there was more than one. Normally, there wouldn't be anyone in the village at this time of the year, and, from the sounds, it seemed like they were trained. Putting down the basket, Yili carefully held her belly and walked to the back of Dr. Lin's hut. Near the study, there was a small window. Although Dr. Lin didn't like to read those books, he cherished them very much and often opened the window to let in some fresh air. As she approached the opened window, she heard the sounds from inside become clearer. It was obvious that these people were in the study. Yili carefully held her breath and walked to the window. Through the gap, she looked inside. Dr. Lin sat on an old chair with a cold face. There were two men standing in the study. One of them was talking to Dr. Lin, while the other was rummaging through the rows of bookshelves, looking for something. The books on the bookshelves were all messed up and scattered all over the floor. "Old Mr. Lin, we don't want to hurt you. Please take out the thing. It's useless for you to keep it. Why don't you teach it to us and save us some trouble?" The middle-aged man standing in front of Dr. Lin said with a calm smile. It was obvious that he didn't want to be rough with Dr. Lin. Dr. Lin's eyelids twitched, and he indifferently said, "This old man doesn't know what you're talking about." The middle-aged man didn't get angry. He smiled and said, "Dr. Lin, why are you playing dumb? You should know that since we've found this place, we won't be fooled by you. You've already lived here for 30 years. I'm sure you want to continue enjoying your old age. That thing is just a pile of waste paper to you, but it's extremely important to me. Seeing that you and I have a good relationship, why don't you help him?" Hearing this, Dr. Lin's face slightly changed. The corner of his lips trembled. It was obvious that his mood was somewhat disturbed. After a long time, he coldly snorted and said, "What do you mean by this old man, don't understand? I don't know what you're talking about either." The middle-aged man frowned. He looked at Dr. Lin with displeasure and said, "Old Mr. Lin, that thing was originally my family's heirloom. It's only natural that we want it back. If you keep it for yourself, you're going too far." Dr. Lin coldly snorted. He closed his eyes and didn't say anything else. The other man had already searched the entire study but didn't find anything. He said with annoyance, "It's not here." The middle-aged man didn't have much patience. He looked at Dr. Lin with an unfriendly gaze. "Dr. Lin, I've told you that because of your kindness in raising me, we have to be polite to you. However, it's best that you don't refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit." Dr. Lin opened his eyes and looked at him. He indifferently said, "This old man hasn't drunk wine for 30 years. You can leave. If he wants something, let him tell me." Chapter 385. The man smiled disdainfully, "I have a lot of work to do every day. How can I waste my time on such a small matter? Dr. Lin, if you're still so stubborn, then don't blame me for offending you." He raised his chin slightly and gestured to the man beside him. The man stepped forward and grabbed Dr. Lin. He sneered, "Dr. Lin, I'm sorry. Our superiors have ordered us to get the item." Dr. Lin closed his eyes again and refused to speak. A trace of impatience flashed across the man's face. He grabbed Dr. Lin's arm and was about to twist it. Dr. Lin was already over 60 years old and wasn't a martial artist. If he were to twist his arm, it would at least break his entire arm. Crack. A faint sound came from outside the window. The man's hand stopped and he looked at the middle-aged man in confusion. Who's there? The window shook slightly, but they didn't see anyone. The man frowned in confusion. He put down Dr. Lin and walked to the window. He looked left and right before poking his head out. A pair of slightly cold white hands suddenly reached out and clasped his neck. He only felt a chill on his neck, and then a sharp pain, and then he lost consciousness. Seeing his companion suddenly fall on the window, a trace of fear flashed across the middle-aged man's face. Originally, because this wasn't a difficult task, they didn't bring too many people. They didn't expect this small village to be hiding a mysterious expert. Who is it? Come out. The middle-aged man said sternly as he stared at the empty space outside the window. Looking at Dr. Lin, the middle-aged man pulled Dr. Lin to stand in front of him. He carefully stared at the window and retreated outside. Whoosh! A gray figure quickly passed by the window. The middle-aged man's eyes widened, but he only saw a dark light quickly shoot in. His throat suddenly felt cold. He lowered his head and stared blankly at a rough-looking wooden hairpin inserted in his throat. He stiffly fell back. Who is it? Seeing his companion suddenly fall on the window without a sound, the middle-aged man stared at the window with vigilance. His voice trembled unconsciously. He glanced at Dr. Lin standing to the side and quickly stepped forward, holding him in front of him and slowly walking forward. Who's outside? Come out. The middle-aged man's back began to sweat. Originally, he was only here to deliver things to his master. It wasn't a difficult task. Therefore, they didn't bring too many people. They didn't expect that there would be a hidden master in such a secluded mountain village. Come out. If you don't come out, I'll kill him. Grabbing Dr. Lin, the middle-aged man stared at the window but didn't move forward. Instead, he slowly moved toward the door of the study. Shwa, a gray shadow flashed past the window. The middle-aged man's eyes widened. The gray shadow flashed by so quickly that he couldn't see what it was. Clenching the dagger in his hand, the middle-aged man gulped and retreated to the door with Dr. Lin. Just as he was about to reach the door, the window creaked and shook. The man was startled and hurriedly pointed the dagger at the window, only to see a dark light shoot out. The man opened his mouth and weakly lowered his head, only to see a somewhat rough wooden hairpin inserted in his throat. He blinked his eyes, but found that there was nothing he could do. He could only let go of Dr. Lin and fall backwards. Dr. Lin looked down at the middle-aged man lying on the ground with his eyes wide open. Of course, he knew who the owner of the hairpin in his throat was. He raised his head to look at the window, but Yi Li's figure didn't appear. After a while, heavy footsteps came from outside the door. Yi Li appeared at the door of the study. Seeing Dr. Lin in a daze, she worriedly asked, "Master, are you all right?" Dr. Lin shook his head silently and looked at Yi Li. Yi Li forced a smile. "Did I scare Master?" "I." Dr. Lin sat down on a chair in exhaustion. After a while, he said, "At first, this old man felt that you weren't simple. Now I know that I was wrong. I won't ask where you came from. You can leave by yourself later. It's not safe here." Yi Li looked at the corpses on the ground and by the window and frowned. It wasn't a good idea to talk in a room with two corpses, but she didn't have the strength to deal with the two corpses. Yi Li found a place to sit down and comforted the uneasy baby in her stomach. She frowned and smiled bitterly. "Master, in my current state, where do you want me to go? Not to mention the possibility of encountering poisonous snakes and fierce beasts, she couldn't even bear the exhaustion of crossing mountains." Dr. Lin sighed and shook his head. "Do you think I'm chasing you away? This old man has to go. If I don't go, I'm afraid I'll implicate the innocent people in this village." When he said this, the old man's expression became sad. For an old man in his 60s to leave the place he had lived in for decades, it wasn't something that could make him happy. Is it? Lin Yuan? Yi Li asked softly after a moment of silence. Dr. Lin was stunned. After a long silence, he let out a long sigh. If Dr. Lin didn't want to say, Yi Li didn't want to force him. Although she didn't know what Lin Yuan wanted from Dr. Lin, she didn't want Dr. Lin to think of her as someone who coveted his treasure. After thinking for a moment, she said, if Master doesn't want to give it to him, why not destroy it? To cut off his thoughts. If he was raised by Master since he was young, who else would Master give it to? Dr. Lin forced a smile and shook his head. He stood up and walked to the door. Yi Li didn't move. She looked at the two corpses with some annoyance. If it was in the past, it wouldn't be difficult for her to deal with the two corpses. But now, it was impossible. Dr. Lin was old and there was no way she could let him deal with these things. Just as she was thinking about it, Dr. Lin returned with a plain porcelain bottle in his hand. He walked to the middle-aged man lying on the ground and opened the bottle to shake out some of the powder. Then, Yi Li was surprised to find that the moment the powder touched the corpse, it emitted a pungent smoke and began to corrode the corpse on the ground. In less than a moment, the originally burly man was left with a puddle of water on the ground. Even his clothes weren't left. Then, she watched as Dr. Lin walked to the other corpse and shook off some of the powder. Seeing that the corpse was corroded and melted, Yi Li couldn't help but rub her nose. After being together for so long, she realized that her unknown master was actually so cruel. Seeing Dr. Lin calmly deal with the two corpses, Yi Li was now convinced that her actions didn't scare the old doctor. Looking at his practiced and calm appearance, he clearly wasn't a novice. After finishing all of this, the master and disciple who weren't familiar with each other looked at each other for a long time before they remembered to move to the outer room. Although there was no more eyesore in the room, to be honest, the smell that was left behind wasn't very pleasant. Chapter 386. They sat down in the outer room and Dr. Lin calmly poured 2 cups of tea for himself and Yi Li. After taking 2 sips of tea, Dr. Lin seemed to have calmed down a little. He said, I can't implicate the innocent people in the village. I can't stay here any longer. Yi Li was silent for a moment. She said, from what Master said, that person is not a soft-hearted person. How can Master be sure that he won't harm the villagers after Master leaves? If that's the case, why would Master persuade me to leave? Although I haven't known Master for long, I always feel that he is a good person. Dr. Lin was speechless. He really couldn't guarantee that after he left, that person wouldn't get angry and attack the innocent people. Otherwise, he could have just settled Yi Li in any family in the village, and there would have been no need for her to leave this place with a few months of pregnancy. In any case, the road outside was too dangerous for a pregnant woman who was only a few months pregnant. After a long time, Dr. Lin asked, do you have any ideas? Yi Li shook her head. She looked at Dr. Lin regretfully and said, I don't even have the ability to protect myself now. Unless I can leave this place and return to Hangzhou as soon as possible. Hangzhou. Dr. Lin looked at her. Why do you think I have a way? Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled. She pointed at the study room filled with books. The villagers told me that you have never left this place in the past 30 years. But, they also said that you only brought some simple luggage and a child with you when you stayed here. Those books obviously couldn't have been sent here so easily, so you must have left this place many times over the years without them knowing. And you definitely didn't need to come and go for as long as a few months. Dr. Lin looked at her and sighed. You are indeed very smart. You saw it from the beginning, didn't you? Yi Li smiled but didn't say anything. Dr. Lin looked at her and shook his head. It's useless. I haven't walked that road for more than 20 years. You can't leave now, and I can't leave either. I'm old. Yili had already expected this, so she wasn't too disappointed. She tilted her head and thought for a moment before asking, I guess they took the water route. I fell off a cliff near Hangzhou City, and when I hit the water, I was sucked into a dark whirlpool, and then I was washed here by the underground river. Dr. Lin nodded approvingly. You're very lucky. You didn't drown, nor did you get hit by a rock in the water. Even your child is fine. Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled faintly. I don't think it's because I'm lucky. It's because the person who built the underground river was too meticulous. That's why I wasn't blocked or killed by the rocks in the river. Then Master. What kind of person would spend so much effort to build such a secret passage? Or perhaps, this village itself is hiding some secret. Dr. Lin was stunned for a moment. He looked at Yili with an inquisitive and dangerous gaze. Yili didn't force her anymore. She sat quietly at the table and looked down at her fingers that were still slender despite the calluses. This pair of hands had just easily broken a person's neck 15 minutes ago. Girl, who exactly are you? Dr. Lin stared at her for a while before finally asking. Yili muttered to herself for a moment before softly saying, if Master really hasn't left this place in 20 years, then who I am doesn't have any meaning to you, right? Dr. Lin looked at her and said, I need to at least know that you aren't someone from the Dechu State's imperial family. Yili sighed softly in her heart. Dr. Lin's question revealed a lot of answers. Shaking her head, Yili said with certainty, I'm not someone from the Dechu State's imperial family. Although Mo Xiuyao's surname was also Mo, and he had the same ancestor as the Dechu State's founding ancestor, in terms of blood relations, they were very distant. If it wasn't for the fact that they had a hereditary title, they wouldn't have any connection to the imperial family. And in everyone's understanding, it seemed that the Mahist army and the Dechu State's imperial family were very clear. Therefore, Yili didn't feel any burden in believing that she wasn't related to the Dechu State's imperial family. After receiving Yili's answer, Dr. Lin's expression relaxed a lot. Yili looked at him seriously and asked unexpectedly, Master, what relationship do you have with the previous dynasty's imperial family? Dr. Lin stared at Yili in a daze. He clearly didn't think that Yili would ask such a question. After a while, he asked, why do you think I have any relationship with the previous dynasty's imperial family? Yili opened her lips and gave a faint smile. She carelessly played with the rough teacup in her hand as she said, Master is so concerned about whether or not I have any relationship with the Dechu State's imperial family. Since you're hiding here, it's clear that you and the Dechu State's imperial family, even if it's not an irreconcilable enmity, you definitely don't have a good impression of them. Since this place is still within the Dechu State, and Master doesn't look like an outsider. Also, from the river where I fell off the cliff to the place where Master saved me, I estimate that the distance in a straight line is at least 20 li. That kind of underground man-made waterway isn't something that just anyone can build. Also, it's very strange to build an exit in such a small village that's isolated from the rest of the world. Finally, it said that this village has a history of nearly 500 years. Also, the ancestors have decreed that the villagers can't read for generations. I feel that they didn't hide here by chance. They were protecting something. Although it's very likely that most of the villagers don't know, there are still some people who know, right? Dr. Lin couldn't help but sigh as he looked at the woman in front of him. You know too much. Yili blinked innocently and looked at the old man in front of her. Master, do you want to kill me to silence me? Just like those two people just now. After saying this, Yili pointed to the inner study. Dr. Lin couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth. Who killed those two people? Dr. Lin shook his head helplessly and said, you don't need to test this old man. I can see through your actions just now. It's still not certain who will kill who. Yili smiled as she raised her teacup. She made her smile even more pure and kind, a master for a day is a master for life. This disciple definitely won't do such a disgraceful thing. Master, why don't we think about what we should do in the future? Since we all want to live well. Dr. Lin glared at her unhappily and said, "It's you who wants to live. I'm an old man who has lived long enough." Yili smiled as she poured him a cup of tea and said, "The neighbors in this village haven't lived long enough." At the mention of these simple villagers, the old man's hand that was holding the teacup tightly clenched. His expression was conflicted and apologetic. These people, they are all descendants of loyal officials, but after so many years, they've probably already forgotten about their ancestors. Actually, there's nothing bad about this. Isn't a peaceful life 100 times better than those people outside? But, if they lose their lives because of those old matters. His heart couldn't bear it. While listening to Dr. Lin's words, Yili tried hard to recall what she could remember about the previous dynasty. A place like the Northwest had been considered remote since ancient times. At least, compared to the prosperity of Chujing and Jiangnan, it wasn't a good place. Yili really couldn't understand what the previous dynasty had to do with this place. After a long time, a thought flashed through her mind. Yili blinked and asked tentatively, "Is the previous dynasty's imperial tomb here?" You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.